Chapter 51, Charms, 3. Nick briefly sensed the magic near Neville and frowned as he felt the blatant rejection the wand in his hand was showing the boy. He cut off his magical sense and approached Neville seriously. "Is that a legacy wand?" he asked sternly. "Why yes, it was my DAW's," Neville stuttered out nervously, and Nick sighed. "The wand is sabotaging you. Both your pronunciation and wand movements are correct, but the wand is refusing to allow your magic to flow through it, so you are struggling when you would have been successful already. I suggest getting a wand of your own as soon as possible," Nick said sincerely before walking over to Ron, who was also struggling. "Calm yourself and relax your wand movements, you are flicking it too far forward," he said helpfully, and Ron took a deep breath and gently flicked the wand forward and said "Lumos," causing the tip of his wand to glow as it was supposed to. Nick nodded at this before walking away to help another student, but he still caught the "thanks" Ron said under his breath and waved it off. The next person Nick helped was Pansy Parkinson from Slytherin, who was having the same problem as Ron with how aggressively she was moving her wand. She saw him approaching and sneered at him. "Bugger off, Mudblood, I don't need your help," she said venomously, but Nick didn't react at all to the insult. "If you say so," he said simply before moving on to another Slytherin who was much more receptive to getting his advice. Flitwick saw this exchange and deducted points from Slytherin for foul language in the classroom. After that, none of the Slytherin insulted Nick openly during the class but told him they didn't need his help. Nick didn't bother with these ungrateful and bigoted people, but made sure that those he did help outshone them, which was insult enough in his opinion, as it directly attacked their pride. A good third of the entire Slytherin currently in the class were steaming mad seeing others surpassing them thanks to his help. None of those in Nick's group were having any problems at all with the spell, and Nick had even given them a small extra lesson on his own version of the spell that they were currently attempting. Tracy was the first to grasp the combo, followed by Harry and then Daphne, who pouted at coming in last. Jealousy was rampant when the three of them cast the spell, even if it wasn't on as grand a scale as when Nick did it. Hermione looked like she was about to pass out from sheer anger as she kept trying to cast the spell based off his single demonstration and failing. She excelled at rote learning, simply couldn't understand why she couldn't cast the spell despite seemingly copying him perfectly. Sadly, she didn't realize that the key to the combo lied in what he named it, the Starlight Dirge, or Final Song of the Stars. Soon lunchtime came and the students headed to the Great Hall to refill before they went back to Charms class. Malfoy apparently couldn't help himself and confronted Nick in the hallway on the way. "Oi, Mudblood," he said loudly, drawing attention to himself from the other students. Nick sighed and turned to look at the Walking Daddy complex. "Didn't your parents ever tell you it's rude to insult someone you are trying to get's attention? Honestly, you must be the shame of all purebloods," he said scathingly. Malfoy visibly cringed at the reply he got, as Nick had just struck him in 4 different ways with a single sentence. "You'll pay for that, Mudblood. Expelliarmus." Malfoy attacked, but Nick didn't move at all as the spell whizzed right past him harmlessly. "You should stop before you embarrass yourself further," Nick said with a bored expression. Anyone paying close attention, however, would notice that Nick's eyes never left the other boy and his hand was near his wand the whole time. "Shut up!" Malfoy yelled angrily before trying to hit Nick with the same spell again. This time, however, the spell was actually heading towards Nick, if only just so he casually took a step to the side, letting the spell miss harmlessly again. Malfoy didn't get to cast another spell, however, as Flitwick caught up with the group and angrily deducted points from the livid Malfoy. "My father will hear about this," he said before storming off aggressively. Flitwick looked like he was about to say something, but Nick stopped him. "He isn't worth the effort, Professor, just let him go," he said seriously, and the teacher sighed and relaxed his stance. "You are right, of course, but his behavior is simply atrocious," the small man said, upset. Chapter 52, Charms, 4. The trip to the Great Hall was smooth after that for everyone, since Flitwick was with the students. Like before, Daphne and Tracy split away from Nick and Harry and sat at the Slytherin table for lunch, while this time Hermione sat across from Nick in a huff. "How did you do it?" she asked unhappily. Nick raised an eyebrow at the question before grabbing a ham and cheese sandwich from a nearby platter. "You will need to be more specific," Nick said casually before taking a bite of his sandwich. "The Lumos spell you cast earlier, I can't get it to work despite matching your movements and incantation perfectly," she said, clearly upset at her failings. A few other nearby people also listened in, hoping to figure it out as well. Nick chuckled and finished off the sandwich since it was merely finger food sized. "There is indeed a trick to the spell that makes merely copying what you see insufficient. We aren't friends, so the best I'll give you is a hint. The key is in the name. Take of that what you will," Nick said before ignoring the girl. He then ate a salad he specifically ordered from the house elves, much to the confusion of everyone. Nick found amusing how almost no one seemed to realize where their food was coming from, though to be fair you never actually see a house elf drop the food off. Those who own house elves but still don't realize where the food is coming from confuse him though. Like, how do you not recognize the same work as what you get at home? Still, Nick decided to act all mysterious by keeping the secret to himself and enjoying his salad. Once lunch ended, everyone headed back to their classes and Tracy and Daphne rejoined Nick and Harry. You know, we got asked by a bunch of people to share with them the secret to your spell, Tracy said with a giggle. Nick shrugged. It's not much of a surprise, as someone who doesn't like failing asked me during lunch too, he said casually while ignoring the fact that Hermione could definitely hear the conversation. The bushy-haired girl? Daphne asked curiously. Harry spoke up this time. Yes, she seemed pretty upset that she couldn't figure out the trick without his help, he said honestly. Did you tell her? Tracy asked with a glint in her eye. Nick grinned at her. Nope, she just got a hint at the secret, same as everyone else who was eavesdropping, Nick said jovially. Tracy smiled. Good, that spell is easily worth a day's bragging rights and I don't want to hand them over so easily, she said with smug satisfaction. My, how very Slytherin of you, Nick joked. I never said I wasn't ambitious or cunning, I'll have you know, Tracy said, feigning offense but still smiling widely. Apologies milady for my insolence at daring to make assumptions, Nick said dramatically, making everyone laugh. The second half of Charm's class was much like the first in that Nick was basically just there to help the other students with the Lumos spell. More than once he was asked the secret to his version of the spell and he always gave the same hint he gave Hermione. Flitwick had no problem with Nick's act of hiding the secret since the hint truly led to the answer and they merely needed to figure it out. Ravenclaw had always been the house of wit and wisdom, so as its head of house he could appreciate the mental exercise Nick was giving them. By the end of the class only 5 other people besides Nick's group succeeded in casting Nick's version of the spell in some capacity, none of which were Hermione. It weighed heavily on her mind as well, since she clearly looked distraught as her classmates surpassed her. Man, she's going to feel terrible when one of these people lets the secret slip accidentally while bragging, Nick thought with a sigh. I did warn her, so what happens from here on is entirely on her, he thought, completely giving up on the girl for now. Hermione was far too stuck in her ways at the moment, and in magic that simply doesn't work. Magic loves imagination far more than it does structure, and unfortunately Hermione is all about structure at the moment. Nick's version of the Lumos charm was a work of imagination, and so it was outside a structural being like Hermione's grasp. Perhaps this incident would allow her to mellow out a bit and actually use her imagination that had been stuck behind ruthless amounts of cold logic. Hopefully it doesn't take getting saved from a bloody troll to get there this time, Nick thought darkly. Chapter 53, Hanging Out. Nick hung out with Harry, Tracy, and Daphne during the free period until dinner, mostly talking about the version of the Lumos charm Nick taught them. You mean that you have more than just this one version? Tracy asked in disbelief. Nick shrugged. It's a really simple charm with a whole bunch of possible uses, he said honestly. Which is your favorite variation so far? She asked curiously. At the moment it's blinding flash version, but that's a work in progress as it affects me as well, Nick said honestly. What does it do? Daphne asked curiously. Well, it creates a super bright flash of light that blinds everyone nearby. Unfortunately the caster is included in that number as well. At the moment I'm figuring out how to exclude myself from the effects, but it's slow going, Nick explained calmly. That sounds irritating. I mean, can you imagine just randomly getting blinded while you are going about your day? Tracy said with a shiver. Harry laughed. You'll get what I have to go through every day then. I don't wear these glasses for show, you know, he said with a smirk. Wow, he really does take after his friends rather heavily, Nick thought, seeing Harry act like him a little. Meh, being a little more like me is good for him anyways, so it's fine I guess. Nick shrugged off the slight change easily. It's a good thing I'm not sharing that version of the spell then, isn't it? Nick asked teasingly. That's so cruel. How can you tell us about such an awesome thing and then not share it? Tracy exclaimed. Try and make it yourself if you are so interested, Nick said with a scoff. But you are supposed to be my endless bag of bragging material, she said, acting betrayed. Nick snorted. Oi. When did I ever agree to such a thing? Nick asked, acting offended while Harry and Daphne were trying not to laugh from Nick and Tracy's antics. They were failing. But my bragging rights, Tracy said while making puppy dog eyes at Nick. Ha! Joke's on you, I'm immune, Nick said with a laugh. No, Tracy said in horror. It's over, Tracy, I have the high ground. Nick said, imitating a certain space wizard. Never. Quick, Daphne, seduce him. She said while pushing her friend and only getting a deadpan look from both Daphne and Nick while Harry was having trouble breathing from laughing too hard. Too much? Tracy asked sheepishly after seeing the look she was getting. Yep, and any hope of me sharing brag-worthy spells is now gone. Nick said calmly, and Tracy looked heartbroken. Do my eyes deceive me, my good brother? A familiar voice says from nearby. Indeed not, my fine sibling, two of our housemates enjoying some Slytherin company. Another voice that sounded almost identical to the first spoke up. Fred and George, or is it Gred and Forge at the moment? Nick asked casually while turning to look at the twin redheads. Ooh, if it isn't our crafty business partner. One of the twins said, realizing who was part of the group. We knew you were a man after our heart the moment we met you, breaking the unspoken rules hat. The other twin said with a wide grin. The twins plopped down on either side of Nick. We approve, they both said at the same time. Nick grinned and wrapped his arms around the twins' shoulders. Everyone, this is Fred and George, fine purveyors of mischief and fun. Fred and George, this is Tracy Davis, Daphne Greengrass, and of course you already know my best mate Harry. Nick made introductions jovially. A pleasure, the twins said at the same time with wide smiles. So what can I do for you gentlemen besides the stink bomb you are trying to stick to me? That is of course. Nick said, making the twin on his right stiffen before chuckling. Seems you figured me out, hey, what gave me away? The twin asked curiously. Nick patted him on the shoulder with his hand. I felt your muscles moving ever so slowly. He said with a smirk. Oh? Now that's some sensitive hands you got there, mate, to pick that up. The twin said, impressed. Nick shrugged. I make jewelry, it's part of the job. He said honestly. Being able to pick up the tiniest changes in the metal is an important skill to have for any smith, since usually you can't just eye it as the metal is so bright it's bleary. Are you trying to make us jealous, mate? 'Cause you are. The other twin said enviously. Nick laughed. Don't act like you two aren't talented in your own way now, he said with a bit of praise. Chapter 54, Attention. We're flattered you think so, but we are just a couple pranksters is all. The twin on Nick's right said depreciatively. Nick slapped him on the back of the head, getting an astonished look in exchange. Don't you bloody lie to me, you two create prank item after prank item from your Merlin damned imaginations like anyone without some damn good talent in the matter could even hope to do such a thing. You may not be the best of students, but if I ever hear one of you say you are talentless, I'll personally prank you both till you or the school begs for mercy. Nick said sternly while squeezing the twins' shoulders with a surprising amount of strength. You win, mate, relax. They said at the same time, rather spooked by his tone that brokered no argument. Geez, never expected to get torn into by an ickle firstie like this, eh, Gred? The twin on his left said with smile. Indeed not, Forge, and it seems we gots to keep our heads high for safety's sake, eh? The other said with the same happy smile. The twins left after that in good moods after getting a rather unorthodox pep talk. You really are a big softy, you know that? Tracy said with a grin. Not at all. I was completely serious about the prank apocalypse I would rain down upon them. I wouldn't stop until the professors got involved or they begged me for forgiveness. Nick said with a malicious laugh. In fact, if I didn't have better things to do with my time, I probably would anyways, just for kicks. Plans for the future, I suppose. He said with a shrug. Please don't actually do that, I'm too young to be in a war. Tracy said, half joking half seriously. Soon dinner came and Flitwick bragged on Nick's behalf to the other teachers, and Dumbledore showed an interest in seeing this spectacle that Flitwick spoke of. The small professor was more than happy to demonstrate the Starlight Dirge combo for everyone. It was on an even greater scale than when Nick cast it, but considering that Flitwick was a charms master, it wasn't hard to believe. In addition to the enchanted ceiling of the Great Hall that already showed the sky outside, a massive amount of star-like lights appeared and faded away beautifully. Most of the students and even the teachers agreed that it was a marvelous creation and was rather impressive to look at. Dumbledore's eyes sparkled as he smiled at the spectacle, and all the houses clapped after it was over as they also enjoyed it. It was only after Flitwick put Nick on the spot by telling everyone he was the creator of the spell that things got awkward. For Nick it did anyways, as everyone in the Great Hall was looking directly at him. He could only sigh and cast the spell combo at the greatest strength he could manage to prove it. His spell was only half the size of Flitwick's, but no one expected him to match a teacher in casting, so it was still impressive in its own right. Nick didn't mind sharing the spell, so he spoke up loudly enough for everyone to hear him about the words and wand movements as well as the hint about how to cast the spell. Dinner was an interesting event after that, as people kept trying to cast the spell throughout it and none of the professors made any moves to stop them. Nick meanwhile was eating as quickly as possible to escape the looks he was getting. He only barely managed to slip out of the Great Hall early since no one else was really willing to rush themselves to follow him. Dumbledore had a look of amusement on his face seeing Nick's reaction to being the center of attention. Nick wasn't shy obviously, but getting stared at hungrily by others was always off-putting. Nick vanished into the Gryffindor common room and went straight to bed since he wasn't interested in dealing with people from every year trying to sucker the trick to the spell out of him. The next day he woke up at dawn and did another hour of reading in the Book of Magical Fundamentals, this time learning an interesting thing about magical creatures. With the exception of a few, many magical creatures have actually evolved into weaker version of their ancestors thanks to wizards. Even dragons were no exception to this, as nowadays they were far less dangerous than they used to be since wizards have basically removed the wild element from them. Living only on reserves, dragons could only grow to the bare minimum of their potential, and so that became their new normal. If they were truly wild, the power the various species would have would be far higher. Chapter 55, Future Plans. Nick looked into this piece of information further and learned that one of the species that had been affected the most by wizards was actually thestrals. Apparently a long time ago the skeletal horse creatures were not only not invisible to most people but even actively wanted to be seen. They actively showed up near those who were dying and would apparently cry out at the moment of that person's death before leaving. Many assumed that the creatures were literally capturing the souls of the recently dead, causing the hunting of the species. The creatures then evolved over time to avoid people much better, using the last remnant of their connection to death to hide from all but those who have seen and understood it. Well, that explains the strange kinship I felt for the things. We are both connected to death in a probably quite literal way, he thought with a sigh. Nick was under no delusion that permanently dying on his other version of Earth hadn't affected his very essence in some way. Clearly something had plucked him out of the ether and sent him into this world with the system, because such a complex thing doesn't just suddenly come into existence. I kinda wish I knew what the thing expected from me though. Nick thought with a sigh. He was about halfway through the book at this point and much to his amusement saw that Hermione actually woke up a little late today. From the tired look she had, she clearly hadn't managed to get much sleep. Probably from constantly failing to use my version of the Lumos spell. Nick reasoned easily enough. She glared at him when she saw him but left the common room for the Great Hall anyways. Harry woke up shortly after that and both of them headed to the Great Hall to get breakfast. Nick actually planned to split ways with Harry in a manner of speaking, since his presence was heavily altering the course of the boy's life and some events needed to play out the same for everything to work out. Nick wasn't some follower of Harry's but had his own things going on and needed Harry and Hermione to join forces, and this was becoming difficult with Nick there. The start of next week though promises to give fate an opportunity to work its magic, since Nick should be able to start working on making rings again, assuming the twins come through in time. This first year should end about the same in the books, and next year should also go about the same minus a few small things. The events of the third year is where Nick has the biggest tampering of fate in store, as he planned to start the process of getting Sirius acquitted over this summer. The men's release may or may not mess up the events of the fourth year, but if it doesn't, Nick had a nasty plan in mind for ruining Voldemort's resurrection play. See, the contract with the Goblet of Fire was a sort of name magic, and so a workaround that Nick had figured out was that he could create a pair of rings that swapped Nick's name for whoever had the other ring, namely Harry. This meant that Nick would be swapped in as the fourth Triwizard Champion and thus tip off Dumbledore to a play at Harry, which should in theory get the old goat to keep Harry safe. This best part of the plan, however, was that only when Nick's name is spat out of the goblet will anyone even know of his plan. Not even Harry will know about it until it's too late to stop it. During breakfast, Neville got his remembrall from his grandmother as well as a letter that seemed to make the boy conflicted. Malfoy, much like in the books, snatched it up and was going to take it had McGonagall stepped in quickly when a whole table of Gryffindors threatened violent retaliation. Oh yes, it wasn't just Harry and Ron who jumped to Neville's defense like in the book, but rather nearly everyone at the table was about to draw wands at the oblivious Slytherin. After breakfast was the flying lessons with Slytherin, and some stuff happened during it. Nick and Harry met up with Tracy and Daphne, who complained at not getting much sleep because of that spell of Nick's. You probably openly bragged at knowing how to cast it, didn't you? Nick asked, causing both girls to go silent and look away. Then don't complain to me about the consequences of your actions, he said, and they looked embarrassed. So how many people in your house figured it out yesterday? He asked with a curious expression. Chapter 56, Flying. Nick found it odd that the first lesson on flying actually included it, but he wasn't going to complain. Welcome to flying class. I am Rolanda Hooch, the referee of Quidditch here at Hogwarts. Outside of this class, today we will be learning proper form for mounting and riding brooms, so pay attention and do exactly as I say. First, stand next to one of the brooms laid out on the ground with it on your dominant side. the professor said, and the students did as instructed. Good, now in a firm commanding tone say up like this. She said and demonstrated. Nick no sooner than had the intention to follow the instruction did the broom he chose jump into his hand like a dog eager to please. Avian royalty, I should have known I would probably have stupid amounts of talent in flying, he complained mentally. The professor noticed this little event but didn't say anything, and the class went on like usual. A few people managed to get their broom into their hands on the first attempt, namely Harry, Draco, and Tracy. Others needed a few tries and others simply had no hope at all, like Hermione and Neville. Once everyone had managed to get the broom in their hands, the professor spoke again. Now that everyone has their broom in their hands, mount it and then kick off hard, then wait for further instructions. She said and watched as they did so. Once again Nick didn't even need to kick off for the broom to begin rising steadily and stop 3 feet above the ground perfectly. Even worse is that he could tell that he didn't even need to use his hands. Once more the professor noted him, though this time with a bit of a glint in her eye. Some of the other students got settled in the air quickly enough, but poor Neville had the worst luck, as not only did he get up in the air but the broom refused to stop going up. The boy fainted from the fear of heights and fell to the ground below, but Nick used a quick spongify to greatly lessen the impact, so rather than a bad break he merely had a bad sprain in his arm. Nick's quick reaction earned Gryffindor an extra 10 points from the professor before she took Neville to the hospital wing. Malfoy laughed once the professor was out of earshot. Did you see his face, the great lump? He said, and a few other Slytherins joined in, though some clearly wanted no part of the boy's drama. Shut up, Malfoy! Snapped Parvati Patil. Ooh, sticking up for Longbottom, said Pansy Parkinson, eager to cause trouble. Never thought you'd like fat little crybabies, Parvati, she said mockingly. Malfoy darted forward to grab something from the ground where Neville had fallen. Look! It's that stupid thing Longbottom's gran sent him, he said, and the remembrall glinted in the light. Give that here, Malfoy, Harry said firmly. Come and get it, Potter, Malfoy said before shooting off into the air on his broom. Harry immediately went to chase, but Hermione called out anxiously, "Don't do it, we'll all get in trouble." She yelled, but Harry ignored her and launching into the air after Malfoy. Everyone watched as the two boys flew through the air with words being said between them, though no one knew what they were. Clearly though, Harry said something that scared Malfoy as the boy threw the remembrall and retreated to the ground while Harry chased the small orb. He caught it right before one of the winder higher up the castle that Nick knew for a fact was McGonagall's office. Shortly after that the elderly witch stormed into the area angrily and snatched up Harry with a stern expression while Malfoy had a sneer on his face. Nick held his broom tightly and wanted to hex the boy but knew better. The broom in Nick's hand, however, seemed to pick up on his hostility and shot out of his hand directly into Malfoy's nose with a sickening crack, breaking it and knocking him out. Everyone looked at Nick in surprise, but he showed that he didn't even have his wand in his hand. Broom malfunction, he said, and everyone believed him since they saw Neville's broom also malfunction. Blood was pouring out of Malfoy's nose as Madame Hooch came back, making her question everyone what happened, and when she heard the same thing from everyone's mouth she gave Nick a deep look before dragging Malfoy to the hospital wing to join Neville. Be honest, did you do that to Malfoy on purpose? Tracy asked in a hushed tone. Nick shook his head. I seriously didn't, not that I'm going to complain about the malfunction, he said honestly, since it surprised him too. Chapter 57, Astrology and Laying Low. The implications of what just happened with Malfoy wasn't lost on Nick, but rather made him decisively shut down any thoughts of playing Quidditch. He had already shown that he was very talented and didn't need to deal with the problems that came from the scouts watching the games. Yes, professional Quidditch scouts regularly sat in on the games at Hogwarts in hope of uncovering talents to be recruited. The minimum age to play the sport professionally was only 16 in the wizarding world, so sitting in on games keeps teams fresh and talented. If Nick decided to play Quidditch, he could tell from today alone that he would probably draw a lot of attention to himself from these scouts and maybe even the publishers as an unprecedented talent in the sport. Nick didn't mind being openly acknowledged academically in the school, but once the entire wizarding community begins to focus on his life instead, it will bring a lot of hassles he simply won't be ready for at the moment. It sucks since the sport looked interesting, but I think waiting till the 4th year to enter the public eye would be best, Nick thought seriously. Flying class was officially ended after that, since Madame Hooch was worried another accident might happen. Next up was astrology, which confused Nick quite a bit, but he quickly found out why it was held so early in the day when the teacher Aurora Sinistra started the class. Welcome to astrology, I am Professor Sinistra. For those wondering why this class is held so early, the answer to your question is that even if we were to observe the heavens on our first class, almost none of you would understand what you are actually witnessing. Therefore until such time as I deem you all acceptably versed in the knowledge needed to understand the heavens above, you will instead be memorizing details about it. This along with your class schedule will change once my standard is met, so please try your best." The dark-skinned witch said calmly. It came as little surprise to anyone that rote memorization like this was precisely where Hermione thrived, as she sucked up the information like a sponge. Nick had little trouble with the stuff either, though the sheer quantity of information the teacher tried to cram into their heads within the short span of an hour gave him and many others a headache. The class ended at 10:15 and the students were released to get lunch before they had their first class. Harry wasn't there for most of the astrology class, but since he was escorted by McGonagall herself he was excused minus needing to copy someone's notes. "What happened after the professor came and grabbed you earlier?" Ron asked Harry curiously, and a few people leaned in to also hear. No one said anything about the argument Ron had with Nick a couple days ago, preferring to leave it in the past. Harry didn't mind doing the same so long as the same argument didn't occur again, because after getting to know the two Slytherin girls he agreed with Nick that the house means little, as they were both good people and friends to him. Nick had the sneaking suspicion that fate was working to recreate the Golden Trio and decisively kept his mouth shut. It did help that he was sure that given enough time Ron might turn out decently enough under Harry's influence. That just leaves the last member of the party. Nick thought, giving the bushy-haired girl in question a brief glance. Harry revealed his rather forced conscription into the Gryffindor Quidditch team by McGonagall, as well as the fact the team's captain was testing him the entire time he was missing. Ron was envious but was happy for Harry and congratulated him. Nick also congratulated Harry and also joked about how famous Oliver Wood was about his training regime. "What do you mean?" Harry asked, confused. "Apparently the bloke runs the team ragged to try and give them an edge over the others. Suppose you'll see soon enough," Nick said with a chuckle at the look of horror on Harry's face. Once lunch was over, the Slytherin and Gryffindor first years headed to the classroom and all made funny faces when they entered the room. The air was thick with the overpowering stench of garlic and incense, while various superstitious things adorned the room. Professor Quirrell was a pale plain man with a thick purple turban wrapped around his head and a nervous expression. Nick knew that this man was not nervous at all, but merely acting that way due to one key detail: his eyes. The man's eyes scanned each and every person who walked through the door as if appraising and judging them. Chapter 58, His eyes stopped for an instant longer than normal on Nick and Harry, especially when they entered the room and found their seats. Welcome to Defense A against the Dark Arts. I am Quirinus Quirrell. Please turn to page 12 of your textbook," he said, stuttering the entire time. I don't think he realizes that he's overplaying his part. Natural stutters only happen at the start of sentences. Nick picked apart the man's act easily and knew that Dumbledore is definitely also aware of this information, meaning he was probably also aware of the face on the back of the man's head. Damn that old man, I can't tell if the third-floor corridor is a trap for Voldemort or a trial for Harry, or even both. Nick thought with a bit of irritation. Despite the constant incorrect stuttering that the professor did, he still conveyed the information in a decent manner. The irritating part was getting past his verbal tick, but otherwise the class was fairly good. Nick noticed the man's gaze on him and Harry periodically throughout the class. This was ignored by Nick, however, as acknowledging it would paint an even bigger target on his back. Nick did make sure to never look the man in the eyes as if he was frightened by him, since having the teacher discover Sanner would raise a problem. One had to remember that Voldemort was an accomplished Legilimens, and unlike Dumbledore or Snape, he definitely didn't have good intentions when he used it. The man couldn't stand not being in absolute control of a situation, so being unable to read Nick's mind might provoke him. The class ended uneventfully and Nick dipped before the man had any chance to try and get him alone. Sure, doing so might irritate the man considerably, but there was little he could do about it, as Nick was practically a ghost in the school if he wanted to be. Thanks to Nick's magical sensitivity, placing a tracking charm on him without his knowledge was impossible, since he checked for it religiously before going anywhere by himself. "Oi Nick, you have any plans today?" Tracy asked as she caught up to him in the hall. "I was going to go info surfing in the library." "Why?" Nick asked curiously. "Ah well, you see, I was sort of wondering if you had a nifty version of the new spell we just learned about yet," she said bashfully. Nick gave her a deadpan look. "No, nor do I plan to create one for such a pointless spell when the Ignis spell is entirely better," he said with a dissatisfied tone. "Does she think I just waste time modifying spells for no reason all day?" he thought, offended at the very idea. "Can I have your version of that spell then?" she asked eagerly. "Nope, I haven't made it yet, so you are out of luck," Nick said with a teasing smirk while she looked heartbroken. "Now unless you actually want to join me with my studies in the library, I will be going now." Nick said with a chuckle as he walked towards the grand staircase. There was a nifty little secret path near it on this floor that led to the first floor and would save Nick some time. The library was like usual quite busy, with most of those here being from Ravenclaw unsurprisingly. Miss Pants made sure to firmly glare at Nick when he entered the library, which he just shrugged off. He quickly found a long disused table in the ancient section near the far side of the library that was well hidden from view. There he grabbed a dusty old tome labeled Magical Theory, by Haramis Roy, that was clearly a fundamentals book. The author was entirely unfamiliar to Nick, but considering the fact he hadn't seen a single language book for whatever language it was written in, he assumed they were older than recorded history and or were pretty much unimportant. Nick opened the regular book he had though to the page he left off on and greedily dove into the information held within. What Nick didn't know, however, was that he had also been seen through by Voldemort during the class earlier. The man wasn't stupid and was well versed in the way people acted in various situations. Nick was far too inexperienced at acting to fool his keen eyes, so he knew that Nick purposefully avoided him for some reason. He was certain that it wasn't because Nick had figured out he was possessing Quirrell, but it made roping him into his cause difficult. Nick had shown far too much talent to be allowed to grow without restraint, and Voldemort refused to have someone grow into his rival when he could prevent it. He would put a leash on him or end him if that wasn't possible. Chapter 59, Forgotten Magic. Nick wasn't aware that he had entered Voldemort's crosshairs as he was devouring the last little bit of information in the normal book of magical fundamentals. He closed the book with a frown at the last piece information that the book discussed. The topic was on where the magic wizard's cast came from, and it was very unhelpful to say the least. See, the book said that no one actually knew for sure but had been using the stuff for as long as recorded knowledge. It is a bit concerning if what this book says is true. Nick thought seriously before moving to the ancient section book. His choice to look at modern before ancient fundamental books was rewarded immediately when the first entry in this book was about the origin of magical creatures. According to this book, most magical creatures were the result of ancient wizards experimenting on local wildlife or already existing magical creatures. There were exceptions to this, however, such as phoenixes, thunderbirds, unicorns and dragons. These species were apparently always around as far as this book was concerned. The biggest cause of new magical species was apparently ancient alchemists, however, as they messed with the natural order of things in their attempts to discover the secrets of the world. The topic after that was about the fundamentals of transfiguration, but with a few small differences. The content was the same as the modern stuff. A huge problem presented itself, however, with the third topic covered in the ancient book, spell crafting. According to the book, ancient wizards didn't usually learn pre-made spells but rather had to make a brand new one for whatever they needed. This wasn't all that strange to Nick, since wizarding schools weren't really a thing at that time. The problem, however, was how the wizards went about crafting their spells, an eerily familiar process of imbuing their wills into their foci and casting the resulting magic based on their own knowledge of the topic. If this sounds familiar, it is because it is as when Nick Smith's the enchantment process is nearly identical at first glance. The biggest difference is that their method is more suggesting the magic do a certain thing, making it unstable, while Nick's process was forcing it to with his very soul, creating a predictable result. No one can ever know about this, or I won't be safe. Nick thought with a serious expression. Clearly this book was written before spell creation via arithmancy and astrology, since those were the ones used for the past 1,000 years. The works of magic from way longer in the past than that still worked even today and exceeded almost all modern magic. So if anyone learned that Nick basically had the ancient method of spell crafting, the whole world will hunt him down if he doesn't share it. He wasn't surprised all that much by learning the similarities that existed between ancient magic and elvish crafting, since assuming that the magic in both worlds worked the same, then them coming to similar ways of use was not that hard to imagine. It wasn't all bad news though, as thanks to this information Nick now had some clue how to apply his crafting style's knowledge to spell making. I won't attempt it anytime soon though, since mastering my current magic system is already difficult enough, he thought honestly, while having an entire library around him to prove it. Nick knew that the magic he has shown so far seems impressive at first glance, but every single one of the professors knew it was actually elementary in nature and could replicate it at a single glance. This didn't even consider pinnacle wizards like Dumbledore, who stood above almost all other wizards in terms of mastery. Nick wasn't stupid enough to think that Dumbledore's level was the absolute limit of this system of magic, but he assumed instead that it was a problem of not having enough time to reach further. In a way, Nick agreed with Voldemort that immortality was necessary to have, or at the very least agelessness. Unfortunately, however, the Dark Lord's method came with the side effect of crippling your potential. Pragmatically speaking, a single life in exchange for all the time in the world was a damn good deal. Especially when you could just regret your actions to reabsorb the soul fragment and heal the damage done to your soul. It didn't make much sense to Nick when he read that little fact in the books, since it was far too easy to do. Humans regret even the most inconsequential of things, so getting the genuine regret for your actions was really easy, though truly evil people seem to have issues with this for some reason. Chapter 60, Dumbledore's Interest. Nick packed up the book and headed for dinner since he didn't feel like skipping out on the delicious food. For him it was a normal meal, but for the teachers it was an odd situation as Dumbledore questioned the teachers who had Nick in class today how he fared. Madame Hooch and Professor Sinistre both explained their observations of him, with Madame Hooch in particular mentioning that he showed an extraordinary talent in flying. She cited each of the unusual instances involving the broom that he had, including how it malfunctioned in such a manner as to break Malfoy's nose. Dumbledore was surprised to hear this and remembered the unusual wand Nick possessed in its core and wondered if that may be the reason for this particular incident. The old man had no doubts about Nick's talent as he had proven it over and over again, but it was hard to pin down his personality without probing his mind for details. So far Nick had proven to be both cunning and loyal, but he had also shown a sharp temper as well, with vicious mockery and rule exploitation to get his way. The headmaster had always seen the events from an outside perspective through the minds of those involved, but he was willing to admit a heavy reluctance to try and probe the boy's mind again after the events of the previous attempt. Dumbledore had trouble sleeping for weeks after that incident as he was haunted by the scenes shown to him. There was one person, however, at the professor's table who was cursing mentally at all the attention Nick was getting: Voldemort. Originally he had assumed that Dumbledore was only interested in Nick to keep the boy from following his own path, but at this point he realized that was only part of the truth. The old wizard was genuinely curious about the boy for some reason and actively sought out information on him. This was a problem for Voldemort as it meant that the boy was beyond his grasp at the moment, since it would draw unwanted attention if something happened to the boy. This made him unhappy, but he could only decide to postpone any plans on the boy until summer break, when he had a new body from stealing the Philosopher's Stone this year. Nick meanwhile was stuffing his face with various protein-rich foods cleanly. This was very much unlike Ron, whose face was stained with grease and other things from his messy way of eating. I wonder if the elves know how to make ramen. I should check this weekend since I'll have time. Nick thought, suddenly having a craving for seafood ramen. Surprisingly enough, there was no seafood available at the feast, which was a shame to Nick as he loved the stuff. Once the meal was over and Nick had refilled his dessert stash, he went to bed since he had an interesting day tomorrow with Transfiguration after Dada and History of Magic. Unlike the rest of his classes, Nick knew with absolute certainty that he was talented at Transfiguration, since the words Supreme Transfiguration were included in his wand's description. The problem he had instead was that he wasn't quite sure how far he could push it before McGonagall get irritated at him showing off. Do I only turn the match into a simple silver needle or turn it into Damascus? Is that also too far, or should I give it designs as well? Nick wondered as he went to sleep. I see you are acclimating yourself to your surroundings before forging again, good. A certain elf said in the dream. Perhaps if I myself had done so rather than falling prey to my own pride, things wouldn't have ended for me as they did. He said with a melancholy sigh before the dream ended and Nick woke up at dawn once again. Did he just show up just because he could, or is there actually a reason behind it? Nick wondered, confused, since the elf only spoke 2 sentences before the dream ended. Nick cracked open his ancient book to continuing reading while making sure its contents were out of view in case someone else got up within the next hour. One such person did indeed show up in the form of a bushy-haired brunette who looked very unhappy to see him. She couldn't leave, however, as curfew wasn't over until 7 when breakfast started, so she had to sit in the common room angrily. She did try to see what he was reading, but Nick was having none of that since she was rather irritatingly competitive and might try and figure out what language it was written in. That would be understandably bad for Nick, and as a result he simply refused to let her see what he was reading. Chapter 61, Transfiguration. Being denied satisfaction to her curiosity only served to irritate the girl even further, but she was far too proper to break the rules to get what she wanted. Nick was actually worried the girl's head might pop with how her veins were pulsing under her skin and her clear anger. Hell, her wand wasn't even in her hand and it was popping constantly to vent away the rampant magic energy she was exuding. Once 7 hit, Nick decisively sent the book into greed before leaving for breakfast, and also for Hermione's safety. Having one of the golden trio die from an aneurysm out of sheer rage at him would be very bad, and Nick didn't want anything to do with it. Can wizards even have aneurysms? He stopped in thought halfway to the Great Hall. They can just clear away the causes with magic, right? So no, he pondered deeply. This was a weird topic to fall in thought about, but Nick was a weird individual, so it wasn't anything new. He eventually made it to the Great Hall and ate some honeyed toast and bananas. Harry showed up at about 7:25 alongside Ron and Hermione, who was apparently nagging them for sleeping in. She saw Nick but seemed to decide to ignore him, even though she was clearly still upset from earlier. Once the time for Dada started to draw near, Nick left the Great Hall with Tracy and Daphne while making sure he was one of the first people there so he could snag a desk at the back of the classroom by the door. Nick didn't want to give Voldemort even a single chance to try and pull a fast one. No one seemed to care though, so it wasn't a problem for the entire class. All they were taught today in the class was the second version of the same spell as yesterday, which merely turned the color from red to blue. Nick once again ducked out the door the moment the class was dismissed and played it off that he couldn't stand the smell of the witch his friends agreed with. He wasn't lying either, as the room truly did smell horrible and was killing his nose. Astrology was no better than the first class since Professor Sinister once again forced a mass of information down their throats to try and get them to the interesting part of the subject. Everyone knew this of course, but it didn't mean they enjoyed having to copy down a huge amount of information all at once. Lunch came after that and Nick once again ate his fill before heading to the Transfiguration classroom. McGonagall was indeed in the room waiting, however she was in her animagus tabby cat form on the desk. "Good morning, Professor," he said to the cat with a knowing grin that seemed to catch the teacher off guard. She merely nodded at him before he took his seat near the front of the room to get a close look at her transformation. If she realized this, she made no motion to stop him, so he assumed she was confident that he wouldn't learn anything useful from it. "Worth a shot though," Nick said with a shrug. Soon more and more students started to enter the room, but Nick was more focused on copying down the contents of the blackboard that had a spell and some rules on it. Not like normal don't do this kinda rules, but transfiguration rules, like the formula for most transfigurations. Once everyone was in the classroom, McGonagall jumped off the table and transformed in mid-air into her normal form. Most of the class oohed or awed at the trick, but Nick merely smirked at the elderly witch who had the faintest look of amusement. Transfiguration is some of the most complex and dangerous magic you will learn at Hogwarts. Anyone messing around in my class will leave and not come back, you have been warned, she said seriously before waving her wand, turning her desk into a living breathing pig before turning it back all wordlessly. Everyone was excited about the class thanks to this display, but quickly found out that they weren't going to be turning anything into animals for quite some time. Rather, they were instead going to take a bunch of complicated notes before getting to a practical session. The entire first part of the class was dedicated to taking these notes. Nick was way ahead of everyone else, however, as he had started earlier and so was done before them. Tracy glared at him when he just sat there with a smug look while she was still writing. McGonagall specifically looked over his notes since he was already done, but merely nodded in acceptance and left him alone. Chapter 62, Transfiguration, 2. Once everyone was done, they took a brief break to ease their minds a bit before the second portion of the class began. "How could you just let me suffer like that? I thought we were friends," Tracy asked dramatically. "You could see the board just as well as I could, besides I was the first person here, so I got started earlier than everyone else is all," Nick said with a scoff. "I'm still mad, and I'll only forgive you if you give me a special spell no one else knows," she said while puffing out her cheeks. "Looks like I'll never be forgiven, oh well," Nick said with a shrug as he began to lovingly polish his wand with a special potion made just for that purpose. "Oi! I was just joking, don't give up so easily," Tracy said in a panic. "I am aware, what would you ever do without me after all?" Nick said with a grin. "Wow, arrogant much?" she teased. "Arrogance is talking big when you can't back it up, confidence is knowing that you can," Nick said wisely. Tracy rolled her eyes. Yes, I get it, you're so great," she said in exasperation. "Just so we're clear on that," Nick said with a chuckle. Soon enough their break was over and McGonagall waved her wand, causing a single match to be placed in front of each student. "Your task for the next 3 lessons is to use the knowledge you have just obtained to turn your match into a needle. You may begin," she said before standing at the front of the class to overlook the students. Nick barely had to do anything as he simply pointed at the match with his wand and spoke Verto. Immediately his match turned into a perfect golden threading needle, including the hole at the blunt end. McGonagall and everyone else was left dumbfounded at how easy he made it look, since he succeeded spectacularly on his first try. 10 points for Gryffindor for being the first to succeed, McGonagall said plainly, since she had a sneaking suspicion that Nick was going to cause her headaches. Tracy attempted to copy Nick, but her match merely grew slightly more pointy on one end and she pouted. "Afraid this isn't one of those things I can really give advice on, since it's based on the person doing the spell rather than the spell itself," Nick said with a helpless shrug when he saw the begging look a few people gave him. "You are quite correct, Mr. Iron, but what should we have you do now that this task is clearly inadequate?" McGonagall said loud enough for everyone to hear. Nick fell into thought for a moment before causing a golden galleon show up on the table in front of him. How's about a game I just came up with then? Nick asked with a smile. McGonagall seemed interested. Oh? And what might the rules of this game be? She asked curiously. It's quite simply really, since I can only do inanimate to inanimate transfigurations currently the topic will be that. So to begin with I will transfigure this coin with many visible flaws and then you'll transfigure it into something else but with one less flaw. We will repeat this over and over again until one of us can't anymore. Materials can be reused but shapes and materials must always be a different combination in such a case. Nick explained eagerly. Both an exercise in transfiguration and memory? Very well, I shall indulge you. McGonagall said before transfiguring an intricate and comfy chair out of the stone floor. Nick changed the coin at first into a wooden sphere but many parts were still golden and it was uneven and dented all over, a terrible transfiguration really. McGonagall then waved her wand turning it into a small quill only slightly less flawed than the sphere before it. This went back and forth for the remainder of the class to the point it started to get really heated. McGonagall didn't even realize that the rest of the class wasn't doing their assigned work as they watched the game instead. Over time most of the flaws vanished but due to the rules at least one visible flaw must always remain so that flaw started to get harder and harder to spot. Right before the end of the class McGonagall played a little dirty to win by turning the thing into a small glass statue of a bird but with a single sand grain sized piece being ice instead. Nick looked and looked but simply couldn't find the flaw until she pointed it out announcing her victory. She clearly enjoyed the game as she was smiling widely and she didn't even assign homework to the class. Chapter 63, Talk. Well actually McGonagall actually did assign homework but since it was literally just to play this nifty game Nick came up with to familiarize themselves with transfiguration it didn't really count. Most of the students had planned to try it out themselves anyways since it seemed pretty fun, much like wizard's chess. Mr. Iron, if you would please stay after class, I have something to discuss with you. McGonagall said while everyone was packing up making his friends worried he was in trouble. I assure you that he is not in trouble, in fact this is likely a very good thing for Mr. Iron. The professor said reassuringly after seeing Nick's friends preparing to defend him. Tracy, Daphne, Ron, and Harry all relaxed hearing this and Nick told them to go on ahead and he'd catch up with them later. Once alone McGonagall spoke to Nick again. I will be forthright with you Mr. Iron, I do not believe my normal lessons would be of any benefit to you. She sighed. Transfiguration is a complex and demanding art in even the simplest things yet to you it is almost like breathing, you do it instinctually. Normally I might consider if you may in fact be a metamorphagus much like a previous student of mine with similar talents in the field. However beyond your undeniable talent you show no outward signs of the ability at all, not even a single one. This leaves me at a loss as to what to do with you in class. McGonagall said honestly. Nick was aware that he wasn't a metamorphagus as he had tested that once he learned he had bloodline abilities at the orphanage. He was slightly surprised to hear that the supreme transfiguration talent from his wand was almost the same as that of the abilities however in the art. It does make sense though if you consider what was known about the ability. Nymphadora Tonks was never shown to need effort to transform, she simply did. Nick thought calmly. I am afraid this will need to be discussed with Albus in order to proceed. The professor said seriously and Nick immediately snapped out of his thoughts and focused on the teacher with an intensity that startled her slightly though she hid it well. I'm afraid I don't understand how this requires his attention, could you please clarify? He said while trying not to seem anxious. He failed. Is there a reason why you seem so averse to Albus? McGonagall asked sternly. Nick shifted in place under her hard gaze nervously. You haven't likely thought of it before but if he ever decided to do something who could actually stop him? No one could. Can you even fathom what being put in front of such a being would be like for someone like me? To have a single person look at me and decide my fate in an instant and there's not a bloody thing I could do about it. Nick said venting his frustrations. Dumbledore had been like a boot hovering over Nick's head since he found himself in this world and even if he never showed it that fact terrifies him. McGonagall was taken back by his words but truly thought about it and couldn't help but agree with the point he had made. In the face of someone like Albus a weak child like Nick must feel like he was being judged by a deity, kind or otherwise was irrelevant. She herself had once felt that kind of powerlessness in the face of Voldemort and so understood how dreadful it was. She sighed while I could try and offer reassurance of Albus's kind nature. You are not wrong to feel the way you do. So here is what I'll do, you will not need to be present when I have my discussion with him about your education if you would prefer. She said warmly in an attempt to calm him down. Nick visibly relaxed as he sighed in relief. That would be for the best I suppose. He said honestly. This meeting came to an end after that and McGonagall could only watch him leave with a conflicted expression. Nick sighed as he left. There's no way the old man won't learn of this, but it was bound to happen eventually. I understand the guy has the best intentions, but the fact remains that I amount to little more than an insect he could crush with but a thought. Until I can have some form of protection from the man I want to stay as far from him as possible, he thought seriously and then forcefully cheered himself up before heading to meet up with his friends, as they didn't need to know about his problems. Chapter 64, Tricky Chat. Nick was pretty good at manipulating his own facial expressions, since remaining stone-faced all the time makes people avoid you. In public you need to look calm or cheerful in order to fit in, a fact he learned the hard way in his past life. While the memories regarding information that this world simply lacked were gone, his habits and temperament hadn't changed much. In fact, losing his previous world's memories barely affected his person at all, which he assumed was due to some mystical thing he simply couldn't understand at the moment. He soon caught up with his friends but noticed the awkward situation they were in as Ron was trying to avoid the two girls. "Stop being such a git and try getting to know them before you judge them, they don't bite," Nick said to Ron with a cheeky grin. "Well, Tracy might, but she's the exception in this case," he joked, and Tracy looked offended, but Harry and Daphne laughed. Ron relaxed a little, seeing that they were in fact normal people, and nervously tried to start a conversation about the only thing he was knowledgeable on, Quidditch. Daphne could only sigh in exasperation, since as it turned out Tracy was also a huge Quidditch fan. "So what was that whole bit with McGonagall about?" Harry asked, drawing everyone else's attention back to Nick. "Damn it, Harry, I almost got everyone to forget about it till you went and said something." Nick cursed mentally. "It was simply about how I am too advanced to learn alongside the rest of our year," he said casually, like it wasn't a big deal. "What?" they all exclaimed, dumbfounded, making Nick flinch slightly. "What, you didn't think that I kept up with the professor in that game with luck, do you?" Nick asked with a scoff. "But how?" Tracy asked jealously. Nick shrugged. "Talent mostly, the subject just comes to me easily," he said with shrug. "That's so not fair," Tracy said with a pout, and Nick chuckled at her act. "I didn't choose to be like this, you know," Nick said honestly. "Can't you I don't know, slack off so the rest of us don't look so bad?" she asked in exasperation. Nick snorted. "Absolutely not, that would be wasting my potential for someone else's benefit. That's like asking Harry to stop flying because he is too talented at it, rather unfair to him, no?" Nick said seriously. "Yeah, I know, but still," Tracy said with a sad look. "Cheer up, mate, I'm not going away or anything, just learning a bit different than you," Nick said to cheer her up. "You know she's just trying to get you to part with some unique spell or another, right?" Daphne asked, getting a betrayed look from her best friend and a chuckle from Harry. "Oh, I know, but it's 1,000 years too early for her to think she can pull a fast one on me," Nick said with a grin. "Drat! I was sure this plan would work." Tracy cursed at her failure, and everyone including Ron laughed. "You know you could just modify a spell yourself, right?" Nick asked with a smirk, knowing her answer already. "What? Why the bloody hell would I do that for when you are a walking treasure trove of the things already?" Tracy asked with a scoff. Nick shrugged. "No idea, but then again no man knows why women do as they do, or at least if any do they don't share that knowledge," he said, and the other boys nodded at his sagely wisdom. The girls tried to argue about that topic but were quickly crushed by the boys' overwhelming amount of evidence to back them up. The group of course completed the homework the professor gave them, with Nick helping them improve the best he could. An interesting thing that Nick noticed when normal students like his friends played the game was that they also grew very quickly in the art. Not like him of course, but the game worked well to ingrain the fundamentals of transfiguration into them, which let them change an object far easier. Dinner came in a short 2 hours, and the group split up based on their house to eat, with Harry, Nick, and Ron continuing their chat about what Hagrid might want, since Harry had gotten an invitation to see the half-giant at breakfast. It was set for their free time tomorrow, so it might just be a social visit to see how Harry's first week was going. Nick remembered this was when the Golden Trio learned about what was being guarded in the third-floor corridor in the books. Oddly though, one of the precursor events of Malfoy challenging Harry to a wizarding duel simply hadn't happened, so it was less important to them to know. Chapter 65, Friday. Dumbledore couldn't help but have a complex expression as he looked at Nick from the professor's table in the Great Hall. He had spoke to Minerva earlier and learned that not only was the boy just as gifted at transfiguration magic as a metamorphagus, but that he was cursed with situational awareness. Most children his age wouldn't realize what his power and influence could accomplish, but Nick did, and it made him clearly terrified of him. It was rather ironic to Dumbledore that the boy is afraid of him while he was afraid of the boy's potential. This did explain a considerable amount about the boy's behavior, however, in school that was an odd mix of cold introverted and radiantly extroverted. Too much situational awareness is very much a curse, as it can leave one paranoid and unable to enjoy their everyday life fully. Unfortunately nothing can be done to fix this problem at the moment as the gap between he and I is simply far too vast and he knows it. Wait, perhaps. Dumbledore fell into thought but smiled lightly as a plan formed in his mind. The next day Nick woke up at dawn and left the common room immediately after getting dressed to head to the nearby disused classroom. Nick figured that it may be best if he simply avoided Hermione entirely till fate could work its magic. Besides, it's irritating having to hide what I'm reading from her every day to keep her from trying to figure it out. Nick thought honestly as he propped himself up in a chair to read his book in peace. Unfortunately he had underestimated how stubborn Hermione was as she tracked him down when she failed to find him in Gryffindor Tower. "Why are you here?" Nick asked, irritated at the bushy-haired interruption to his piece. "You weren't in the common room, so I came looking for you," she said, like that made any sense at all. "Okay, but why did you come looking for me? I thought I made it abundantly clear that I'm not interested in whatever childish competition you seem to think we're having," Nick said with no small amount of vitriol. The girl withered under his glare but couldn't come up with a retort since he was correct and it was only her who seemed to care. She could only tear up and flee the classroom, upset at the situation, while Nick was contemplating if his plans were worth this hassle. At 7 Nick closed the book, having not learned anything of note in the last hour save some small details missing from the normal book. He walked to the Great Hall and sat down at the table where he ordered some grits with pepper jack cheese and bacon cooked in them. Today's schedule was a bit odd as it had 2 classes with 2 periods, though only potions had it this time. Astronomy, charms and finally potions were the classes for today, and no one seemed happy with them. For good reason too, as the first class was basically a cramming session followed by a much more mild practical session on the Lumos charm. The worst part was easily Snape's class though, as he finally caught Harry lacking and took 10 points from the house for it. Nick of course evened out that loss with yet another perfectly brewed potion, Wiggenweld this time. This potion was once again a modified recipe provided by Snape, but Nick was unable to perfect it further since it seemed perfect as is. "That was bloody terrible. I can't believe the greasy git took points because Harry didn't know which salamander's blood was best for Wiggenweld. And did you see the way he looks at Harry, like he wants him dead?" Ron was fuming loudly on the way away from the classroom. Nick shrugged. "Everyone knows he hates Gryffindor. The only reason I think he gives me points is so he has an excuse to give Slytherin more. No offense, girls," Nick said, and neither Daphne or Tracy seemed bothered by the harsh but accurate statement. Harry didn't seem all that bothered by Snape, which Nick found amusing since it seemed to directly remove any joy the big Batman wannabe may get antagonizing him. "You two gonna join us as we go visit Hagrid or Nat?" Nick asked the 2 girls once they reached the separation point. "I don't mind tagging along, if it's no bother, that is," Daphne said hopefully. Tracy nodded in agreement at this. "Yeah, what she said." And so Nick nodded in understanding before walking out onto the castle grounds. Far in the distance was a shabby-looking stone hut with various gardens around it, pumpkins being the most prominent with a huge orange fruit. Chapter 66, Visiting Hagrid. It was a little bit of a walk to reach the edge of Hagrid's gardens from the castle, since the area the school held was truly massive if you included the lake and forest. The field outside the castle that Nick and the others needed to cross was easily a couple miles across. This meant it took a good 30 minutes to reach the hut and knock on the huge rough wooden door. Bark! Bark! Hagrid's dog alerted to the sound before Hagrid silenced it. "Down, Fang, they're friends," the half-giant said roughly before opening the door. The group was struck by the smell of dirt, herbs, and animals alongside the heat from the going fire in the fireplace. Everyone except for Nick looked uncomfortable in the heat but entered the hut anyways. "Now that there's a sight I don't see often, Slytherin together with Gryffindor without trouble," Hagrid said in astonishment. "That would be my fault," Nick said with a laugh. Hagrid patted Nick on the shoulder, making him wince in pain from the force. "Good on you, lad, never much cared for that whole rivalry business myself. It's good to see I'm not alone in that," the man said happily. Daphne, Tracy, and Ron introduced themselves and tried to make themselves comfortable on the massive rough couch. Nick got some odd looks as he settled near the fire, but no one said anything about it. He relaxed unconsciously from the heat that reminded his body of a furnace and brought his mind to razor-sharp clarity. The change to his soul and body was from a crafting method, so he was most comfortable in an environment similar to a workshop in temperature. This was merely the first of the changes he was going through internally, but worth mentioning nonetheless. "Tea and cakes?" Hagrid offered as he filled a kettle with water. "I'll take some tea, but I think I'll pass on the cakes, thanks," Nick said with a smile. The girls and Harry followed his lead, but Ron assumed that the cakes being offered were normal food and agreed to some. He was wrong. What he received was a brown object that looked like a hockey puck made of bread and was twice as hard. He learned the hard way that biting into one of Hagrid's cakes as hard as you could was a poor decision as he chipped one of his teeth. Hagrid looked confused when this happened and checked the cake to see what was wrong with it but couldn't figure it out. Harry and the girls were glad that they followed Nick's lead after seeing this event take place. Nick meanwhile was acting like he didn't have any idea that the cakes Hagrid made definitely weren't safe for human consumption, all while sipping on his tea. The tea was pretty good, unlike the cakes, which made sense as Hagrid grew the plants himself and had crossbred it over time with the help of Professor Sprout into what it was now. "So you finally finished your first week o' school, whatcha think?" Hagrid asked while sitting down in a huge armchair with a literal flagon of tea, leaves and all. "Not a huge fan of Snape or Binns, but can't really complain otherwise," Nick said honestly. "The same as him, but add Quirrell to that list, the man stutters too much," Tracy complained. He didn't used to be like that, but he left for a year of practical experience and came back like that, right? Pity it is," Hagrid said, understanding what she meant. "As for the other two, they've got their own issues, but since Dumbledore trusts them, they must be all right at their jobs," the half-giant said, purposefully not looking at Harry when he did. Nick knew that Hagrid was the groundskeeper when James Potter walked Hogwarts grounds and was aware of the treatment Snape got from the man and his friends. Hagrid didn't want to have to explain to Harry that the reason Snape hated him was because his father, who was a good man and is dead, was a vicious bully in school. It was so bad that the brief glimpse of it that was seen in the books was enough to make Nick hate the man at that time in his life. Bullies like James Potter and his friends were different than normal bullies in that they actually went out of their way to target Snape, who was minding his own business rather than it being a convenience thing. "He's dead, calm down." Nick chastised himself for starting to get worked up by the thoughts of the unchangeable past. "If all goes well, I should be able to get my workshop set up by Monday. So you can come visit me sometime to check it out during our free periods," Nick said, changing the subject. Chapter 67, Visiting Hagrid, 2. "Oh really now? Whatcha need a workshop for?" Hagrid asked, interested. Nick showed off greed. "I'm a ring maker and need the workshop to perform my craft," he said honestly. Hagrid looked surprised but impressed. "Ring seems a bit odd, what with the way it moves like that, looks like it itch," he said honestly. Nick took the ring off and tossed it to him. "Not at all, give it a try," he suggested, and Hagrid looked confused but did. The ring grew several sizes bigger and fit on his pointer finger perfectly, much to everyone except Nick's surprise. "Would you look at that, fits like a charm and I can't even feel it moving about," Hagrid exclaimed excitedly. "Hang on, I thought you said you bought it," Tracy pointed out questioningly. Nick grinned and shook his head. "No, I said that it took me a huge amount of effort to get, I never said I bought it," he said mischievously. The two girls thought back to the conversation and remembered that that was indeed exactly what he had said. "You tricked us!" Tracy exclaimed angrily, and Daphne mirrored her expression. Nick scoffed. "I did no such thing, you tricked yourselves while I was completely honest," he said calmly. "You knew we thought you bought it though, she even said you could afford many more after getting that bloodline test," Tracy said defensively when she realized Nick was winning the argument. "Why would I correct you when she wasn't wrong?" Nick asked smugly, knowing he did win. Tracy looked like a goldfish for a moment as she opened and closed her mouth, trying to find some way to rebut him but failing. "See, you can't even find an argument because I'm right, so chill, it's not a big deal," Nick said, and Tracy pouted unhappily. Hagrid chuckled at their antics. "I didn't check earlier, but what's that thing there do anyways?" he asked curiously. "Oh, it's my favorite creation so far," Nick said excitedly. "See, normally it only works like a storage device, like an expanded bag, but when someone tries to steal it or steal from it, it turns into their worst fear and attacks them. I named it greed because much like the sin itself, it can get you hurt," Nick explained proudly while removing a brownie from the ring to show them. "Sounds like a boggart. Nasty things like to show up in the abandoned classrooms in the castle and are never fun to deal with," Hagrid said with a frown. "I took inspiration from them when I created the ring. The storage enchantment wasn't my work though, so I can't just make another, sadly," Nick said regretfully. "We just thought the thing was a storage ring, but it could have turned into our fears this whole time," Tracy asked while looking at the vibrant shifting ring warily. Nick shook his head. "Nat, it only transforms when some tries to take it or take something from it that isn't the one wearing it, perfectly harmless otherwise," he said honestly. "My stuff is pretty handy to have too, since I can make them do pretty much anything if I know enough about the subject. Think of something, anything at all that sounds useful," Nick suggested to Hagrid, who fell into thought. well, I always have a problem keeping slugs out of my gardens. He says after a moment, and Nick had a slight twitch above his eye at how out of everything he could asked about he choose slug repellent. A bit simplistic, but yes, I could make a ring to keep slugs away if I wanted to. Nick said honestly. If you can, I'd be plenty happy to pay you for your work. Hagrid said eagerly, since he already spends large amount of money getting slug repellent anyways. Nick nodded. How large of an area should the effect extend from the ring? He asked, all business at this point. The promise of payment had brought out Nick's inner goblin looking to strike a deal. Well, if you could fix it to cover my gardens, I reckon that'd do just nicely. Hagrid said after a moment's thought. Hold that thought for a moment. Nick said while getting up and walking out of the hut to survey the area in question. If I put the hut as the center of the area, about 25 yards in all directions ought to work. Nick thought as he looked around carefully. He then walked back into the hut and sat back down. I can make the ring cover an area 25 yards around it in slug repellent magic, so you can hang the ring from your room and keep the slugs out of your gardens. Nick said to check if that would work. Chapter 68, Daphne's Request. That'd be a load off my mind if you could, thanks. Hagrid said eagerly. I should be able to get it to you soon after I get the workshop set up. Nick said while writing down the order and specification down for later on a small notepad. How much you reckon it'll cost me? Hagrid asked curiously. Depends on if you want it made of something specific with any extra effects. If you only want a plain dragon steel ring with only that one enchantment, it'll be 1 galleon and 4 sickles, and the enchantment won't ever wear out, so no recharging will be needed, unlike most artifacts. Nick said after doing a bit of mental approximation. If it's like you said, that a mighty fine bargain, are you sure you don't want more? Hagrid said, worried Nick was giving him a big discount. Nick however scoffed. I'm a proud person, so I will only ever charge what I think my work is worth, don't ever forget it. He said sternly, and everyone else couldn't help but nod their heads in agreement. Understood, didn't mean to offend, lad. Hagrid said seriously as he fished around in his coat for a moment. Here, I'll pay now so I don't need to remember later, not so good at numbers you see. Hagrid said as he handed over a slightly tarnished golden coin and 4 silver ones. Nick made a small note next to Hagrid's order information on his notepad. Payment given up front, deliver ASAP. He then deposited the money into greed and nodded at the half-giant. I'll have the finished product sent to you as soon as it's done. Nick said seriously. That's fine, no need to bother walking it down, owl would do. Hagrid said. Could I order a ring as well? Daphne spoke up suddenly, surprising everyone since she was usually quiet. What do you have in mind? I'll need to know the subject to place the enchantment, so I may need longer if it's a difficult to study topic. Nick said honestly. Could you make a ring that protects the mind? She asked quietly, but everyone heard her. That's mind art territory, he can't possibly know about. Hagrid started sternly, but Nick cut him off. I can, but it won't be cheap and it'll take at least a month, since I need to research the topic a bit for the best results. He said, making the half-giant gape in shock. Nick could figure out why Daphne would want such a thing easily enough, as from what he remembered of the books, the mind arts were sort of an open secret that most pure-blood families practiced, or at the very least were aware of. As the heir of one of the sacred 28 families, Daphne was likely forced to learn occlumency by her family, which has the unfortunate side effect of deadening emotions. With a ring that protected her mind, she could release the magic over her mind and live like a normal girl. How expensive? She asked with a clearly nervous expression. Nick shook his head. I can't know in this case until the product is finished, but at least 100 galleons due to the difficulty and obscurity of the subject. He said honestly, making everyone who heard the price flinch slightly. Hagrid didn't gainsay that price either, since the reasons Nick stated were valid, as those who were truly knowledgeable in the mind arts either kept that information to themselves or charged heavily for it. Ron was particularly uncomfortable with the price, as his family barely has twice that amount saved for emergencies. The Weasleys were dirt poor as far as most of the wizarding pureblood community was concerned. It showed too, since all of Ron's school equipment was hand-me-downs or second-hand, even his wand. Harry didn't know all that well what was a good price for any particular thing in the wizarding world, and simply paid prices as is, but even he could tell that that was a large sum of money. You are in luck, however, since I could find a couple books in the library, or it would take far more time. Nick said honestly. I see, I will need to speak with my family before I can make a decision on this subject. Daphne said after a moment, and Nick nodded. The rest of the visit after that is merely idle chatter until Harry found the paper talking about the robbery at Gringotts. Was it the vault we went to that day, Hagrid? He asked, making the half-giant nervous. It doesn't matter, leave it alone, Harry. The man warned sternly. But what if the thief comes after it again, will it be safe? Harry pressed and Hagrid scoffed. Course it will be. Nicholas Flamel wouldn't have given it to Dumbledore otherwise. He said but froze immediately afterwards. You never heard that? He says seriously before sending the group off. Chapter 69, Approved. Who is this Nicholas Flamel and what does he have to do with whatever Hagrid took from the vault a month ago? Harry asked with a frown as the group walked away from Hagrid's hut back to the castle. Nick didn't give out his knowledge on the matter but winced when Tracy froze in shock at the question. Right, nobility members like them probably teach this kind of knowledge to their children, he thought, and could only sigh at this shift from canon. Thankfully Harry learning what was hidden in the third-floor corridor early would probably not affect much. Nicholas Flamel is the immortal alchemist who created the Sorcerer's Stone that could turn stone to gold and create the elixir of life that let him and his wife survive for the last 600 years. He even taught Dumbledore alchemy when the headmaster was younger. She exclaimed excitedly. Is that what Hagrid took from Gringotts? This stone? Harry exclaimed as he put the pieces together. Tracy nodded. That's what it sounds like, but why would he give Dumbledore such a thing? She asked, confused. Who knows what these ancient fogies are always doing behind the scenes? Nick asked with a shrug, trying to get the conversation dropped. That is a good point, I suppose. Maybe Dumbledore is simply studying the stone to try and make his own. She suggested after a bit of thought. Once the group reached the castle, Nick checked himself for tracking spells and finding none save the one cast by Dumbledore, excused himself so that he could seek out Professor McGonagall. Best to put in my request for that room as soon as possible since I am starting to collect orders, he thought as he separated himself from his friends. Nick walked quickly and cautiously through the halls while keeping up his magical senses for any invisible disturbances. This placed considerable strain on his mind and body, caused blood to lightly drip from one of his nostrils. He felt it was necessary, however, since he couldn't afford to be ambushed by someone under invisibility. Quirrell Mort was skulking about the castle at the moment, doing gods knew what, and Nick didn't want to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The books never spoke about what the man and his afterlife tag-along did in their free time besides hunting unicorns, and Nick had no intention of poking that hornet's nest to find out. Nick safely made it to the McGonagall's office near the Gryffindor common room and quickly cleaned away the blood on his face before knocking. You may enter. The elderly witch's voice came from the other side of the door. Opening the door, Nick found out that the room was rather small, with enough room for a large desk and a couple wall shelves, but little beyond that. It wasn't cramped, mind you, just not very large. The room was warmly decorated with reds and golds, likely symbolic to her love of her house, and had a faint scent of agar wood. Ah, Mr. Iron, I was expecting to receive a visit from you today or tomorrow. McGonagall said with a slight smile. Please have a seat so we may discuss what it is you are here for, Biscuit. She said, offering him a tray of English biscuits. Nick sat in the single small wooden chair that sat in front of her desk before taking one of the biscuits politely. I assume I am correct in that your visit is in regards to placing a request to use a certain unused classroom as a personal workshop, yes? The professor asked calmly. Nick looked surprised for a moment before figuring out why she was aware of this already. Flitwick must have mentioned it to you and the other teachers. He stated calmly, and McGonagall nodded. Yes. Phileas was rather eager about the subject after learning of your knowledge of crafting arts. I admit many of us were skeptical of his claims until Albus personally vouched for their accuracy. She said, choosing not to mention the slight twitch that came to his brow at the headmaster's name being added to the topic. I'm self-taught, if that clears things up. Nick said honestly, since assuming the system was now a part of him made this true. It does to a degree, but we are getting off topic. In regards to your request to use a classroom for recreational activities, it has been approved and merely needs you to finalize the choice as to which classroom is to be used with a member of faculty. The elderly witch said with a smile, seeing Nick's expression brighten. She found it a shame how so few of her students showed even half as much enthusiasm to a craft of any sort. Chapter 70, Organic Smithing Experiments. I already know precisely the classroom I would like to use, assuming you are not too busy to see it, that is. Nick said eagerly, but remembered that she might have other plans already. You are in luck, it seems, Mr. Iron, as I just finished my work for the day when you arrived. McGonagall said with a small smile. It's not far from here, near the charms classroom in fact. Nick said as he stood up eagerly. He then led the way to the classroom he had been caught reorganizing by Flitwick earlier in the week. Once they arrived, Nick pushed open the door only to be surprised to find that the room had been entirely emptied and clean save for a small note on the wall. I hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty to remove the unneeded items and cleansed the room for you. Sincerely, Professor Flitwick. McGonagall smiled when Nick read the note out loud, and he also chuckled at it since it was a pleasant surprise. Room 3-06 is your final choice, then I take it. McGonagall said after making a note of the room's designation, and Nick nodded. Very well, then from now this room is officially your domain to use as you please until such time as you graduate or are found misusing it. McGonagall said sternly before reaching into her pocket and taking out a simple iron key. That said, since Phileas showed me this room previously, I have gone ahead and procured a copy of the key from Argus, who holds the only other copy, she said playfully as she held the key out to him. Nick took the key with a grin. Just you watch, greatness awaits this room, he said confidently, and her smile widened. Then I shall look forward to seeing it for myself, she said with a nod of acknowledgement, and then left him in the room alone. Nick wasted no time at all, taking out the rough tools he used at the orphanage and neatly setting them up in a row on the ground against the wall, while he placed the small anvil as well as the stump it was nailed to in the center of the room. Without a source of flame I cannot do anything involving metal. I suppose this is as good a chance as any to branch into unknown territory, he thought with a sigh. From greed, Nick removed a small block of wood with a few cracks down it and a hole at the top that had a rusty blue metal spike embedded. He grabbed a pair of rough pliers and took hold of the spike with it before using his hammer to smack the wood free of the metal. Soon the block of wood was free from the metal, and Nick pointed his wand at his hammer and transfigured it into a sharp wood knife. He then carefully but firmly slid the blade against the wood, removing a small amount of it. He continued whittling the wood until all that remained were 6 rough wooden discs an inch across and a centimeter thick and a large amount of wooden shavings. Nick then changed his hammer into a hand-powered drill to punch a hole through the center of each disc, turning them into rings, albeit horrible-looking ones. Then he whittled them a little more until they looked decent enough, if still a bit rough. Now for the actual hard part, Nick thought as he brought one of the wooden rings to the anvil. He set the ring down on the center of the anvil and removed the transfiguration on his hammer before locking the door to the room. Nervously Nick channeled his spirit, causing the bright glow to form around him before being focused into his hands. He focused on his understanding of life, causing his spirit to take on the dull silvery gray of the ghosts who roamed the halls of Hogwarts. Gently Nick tapped his hammer against the wooden ring and a hum filled the air for a brief moment before boom. The wooden ring exploded into dust. Cough. Cough. Nick coughed as the dust flew into his mouth and nose after the explosion. Taking out a notepad, he wrote down on it: first attempt to smith organic material, result, failure due to structural destabilization. He then grabbed another wooden ring and placed it on the anvil where the previous one was. This time he repeated the process the exact same way as the first attempt, except he lowered the intensity of the energy he was channeling into the ring. This time it took an extra 2 seconds for the ring to explode, which he wrote down in his notepad before grabbing the third wooden ring to try again. Chapter 71, Organic Smithing Experiments, 2. This time Nick not only lowered the intensity of the energy, but he also changed the intended enchantment to a fire-based one. This caused his spirit to turn red and flickering despite actually being stable, as it took on the properties of the element. With a light tap of his hammer, Nick backed away from the anvil quickly, since according to the crafting method elemental failures tend to be rather dangerous. Surprisingly, nothing seemed to happen despite the enchantment clearly going into the wooden ring and binding to it. A quick examination later revealed why that was to Nick. The wood was no longer normal in appearance, but instead had glowing red ember-like cracks throughout it. The system recognized this as a finished ring apparently and gave him 10 points for making it. Nick was confused why it had taken so little effort to have his first success with enchanting an organic material. He carefully considered the details of the experiment to try and figure out what was the reason behind it, but was having trouble. Left unable to find the crux of the issue, Nick resorted to what some might consider cheating by appraising the ring with the system. Ring name, N/A. Grade, Common. Abilities, Detonate. Description: an unstable experimental ring made of oak that took the property of burning during the enchantment process. System appraisal: it's basically a magical grenade that will go off with the slightest infusion of magic. Nick finally figured out what the reason was after reading the appraisal. Organic materials, unlike most metals, have their own traits that have them predisposed to certain enchantments. Wood in this case burns naturally and as a result is predisposed towards fire enchantments, increasing the possibility of them succeeding. This unfortunately was little help for Nick's experiments. His goal wasn't to just be able to put a specific type of enchantment on the material, but rather any enchantment he desired. Nick simply shrugged after understanding this and stored the exploding ring away in greed so he didn't accidentally set it off with his next experiments. He failed for the rest of the tests he performed, but learned a tiny amount with each failure, bringing him ever so closer to his faraway goal. Soon dinner time arrived and Nick went to the Great Hall to eat, he forgot to clean himself off however before arriving as he was too lost in his thoughts. It was only after he sat down to eat that Nick realized that there was something wrong. He noticed that everyone was looking at him funny and quickly found the problem. I'm covered in sawdust, he thought with an awkward chuckle. Sorry about the mess, I got a bit carried away with something I was working on. He explained while waving his wand over himself, collecting all the sawdust into an orb that he then banished. What in Merlin's saga beard could make you look like that? Seamus asked curiously, and the whole table leaned closer to try and hear Nick's answer. If you must know, I was trying to figure out how to make a ring out of wood since I don't have a furnace quite yet. The results tended to explode, but I'd be lying if I didn't say I enjoyed learning from my mistakes. Nick said with a grin. He didn't know that Dumbledore was also listening with a charm and smiled when he heard him. Ah, the drive to learn and improve, always a treat to find it in a student, the old wizard thought, pleased. Not to worry, mate, we'll be able to remedy that tomorrow since we just need to go pick it up from the 3 broomsticks. One of the twins said with a grin. Nick smiled happily. Great. I've been sorely missing the feel of a hot furnace while I work my craft. He said brightly. It shows, mate, who honestly chooses to sit next to a fire in a hot shack like that. While drinking hot tea, no less. Starting to think you are part dragon or something. Ron said jokingly. Did he actually do that? Seamus asked, surprised. Yeah, just earlier when we went to visit Hagrid. Bloke sat down right next to the fire that was going and drank tea without breaking a sweat. It was nuts. Ron answered seriously. Dumbledore asked Hagrid if that was true, which stumped the man for a moment. Well, now that I think of it, he did look pretty comfortable near the fire. The large man said honestly. How interesting. The old wizard said with a smile after hearing this. The rest of dinner was fairly uneventful after that, as no one seemed all that interested in learning more about his experiments. Chapter 72, A Swim in a Heart Attack. Nick turned in after restocking his store of sweets, hopeful about finally getting back in the habit of making rings almost every day. Unfortunately, he failed to consider that not everyone wakes up at dawn on their free days and immediately gets productive. It was only when he sat in the common room for an entire time waiting that this dawned on him. I guess there is no reason to get ahead of myself here, they'll bring it to me when you can. Nick thought before heading to breakfast. It was as usual a simple meal with large amounts of nutrients to support his growth. Once he was done, he headed out of the castle alone towards the Black Lake for a bit of exercise in the form of swimming. It was no secret that the waters of Scottish waters like the lake never get truly warm, but that was what made them so good for exercising in. The exertion on the muscles plus the cold promoted blood circulation in the body, making exercise more fruitful. Nick didn't need a set of swimming shorts since he could merely transfigure his robe into a wetsuit. As a bonus, the wetsuit also made sure that he never got too cold while in the water by helping to trap his body heat inside him. It would be an understatement to say that he drew quite a bit of attention in the next 2 hours swimming and diving in the lake. The best part in his opinion was when he found the underwater viewing window that was in the Slytherin common room and got stared at in stupefaction by the people just hanging out there. Even funnier was that amongst those people were Daphne and Tracy, who didn't really plan to go anywhere today. Why is it always him doing crazy things? Tracy asked with a frustrated sigh after seeing Nick waving at them from outside the viewing window. Daphne shrugged. He is how he is. She said calmly. Yeah, I hope the giant squid teaches him a lesson for showing off all the time though. Tracy said with a laugh, only to freeze when said squid actually showed up behind Nick. There's something behind me, isn't there? He thought, seeing the girl pointing and shouting at the glass. He cocked his head to look and stiffened at what he saw. Yup, that'll do it all right, he thought once his mind stopped short-circuiting from instinctual terror. There, about 2 feet away from him, was a yellow eye twice as big around as he was tall, attached to a dull grey body that he couldn't see the end of in the murky waters. Theory confirmed, Kraken it is then, he thought while constantly reminding himself that this particular creature was friendly and not trying to decide if he would taste good. Nick smiled at the creature before pointing up and slowly swimming towards the surface while keeping an eye on it, as pointless as that was. Nick didn't know why, but he could somehow tell from the eye watching him that the creature was amused at his antics. He got to the surface and immediately took a few deep breaths to calm himself and try to convince himself that he hadn't nearly shit himself at the creature's surprise appearance. Anyone who says that they wouldn't have been briefly terrified at suddenly meeting the legendary beast is either deranged or lying, in Nick's opinion. Time to leave. I think that's enough time in the lake today, he thought as he decisively swam to the shore. By the time he actually got to that point, the 2 Slytherin girls were waiting there already. Do you wake up in the morning, stretch, and then decide to do stuff that defies common sense, or does it just come naturally? Tracy asked jokingly. Nick chuckled as he dried off still in the wetsuit, putting his lithe figure on display. He wasn't ripped or anything like that, but he did have enough muscle definition that it was clear he was no slouch when you could actually see his body. Once dried, he removed the transfiguration on his robes, returning them to normal, much to the two girls' jealousy. Ugh! Just rub in how much better than us you are, why don't you? Tracy said with a huff. As it just so happens, I do indeed have a spell for that. Nick joked, making the girl grit her teeth angrily. If you are quite done with your childish drivel, I would like a word with Mr. Iron. A nasally voice spoke up from nearby. All three of the students stiffened and looked over to see one Severus Snape standing there with a not-so-pleased look on his face, so the usual. Chapter 73, Business Talk. Of course, sir, please excuse us. Tracy said while nervously fleeing the area with Daphne. I assume this isn't about my swim in the lake, considering you certainly wouldn't care about such a pointless thing, correct? Nick asked casually. Snape seemed to appreciate Nick's frankness as the smallest corner of his mouth ticked upwards ever so slightly. Indeed, rather, I have been informed of your talent in creating enchanted objects. It is to my understanding that you claim to be able to add any sort of enchantment should you possess knowledge of the subject. Is this information true? The man asked seriously. Nick would be lying if he said he was expecting Snape to approach him about his ring making, despite the information concerning it no doubt making its way around the school. He nodded in agreement. Yes, though it should be added that if you want a specific effect out of multiple involving the topic, I require further information than if you simply wanted one with all the effects indiscriminately. Nick said, clarifying the information further. I see. I require a ring capable of detecting falsehoods, illusions if you prefer. The man said sternly, and Nick fell into thought as to what that would entail. Do you wish to see through a specific type of falsehood or to be able to detect a specific one? Otherwise, this is an enchantment requiring multiple fields of knowledge, as you are likely aware of. Nick said, looking for clarification. This seemed to surprise and impress Snape, as he hadn't thought that Nick would really put much thought into the request. Glamour spells, detection only. Snape clarified calmly. Nick nodded in understanding. I would need information on the types of spells in this category, the more in-depth the better, but assuming they share similarities, I could make a ring of detection that reacts to their presence. Any particular distance in mind? Nick said seriously. Within 4 meters. Snape said succinctly. Nick took out a notepad and started to write down all these specifications. Any particular metal or design for the ring itself? He asked, and Snape shook his head. All right, so it would take me around a month to thoroughly gain an understanding of this field of spells, then an entire day to craft the ring itself, followed by another for the enchantment process. Add in material cost and you are looking at around 15 galleons 12 nuts for the ring. Is that acceptable? Nick asked, and Snape briefly thought about it before nodding. Will that be all? Nick asked curiously, and Snape nodded before turning and walking away without a word. Well, at least he seems to have a sense of professional courtesy, even if he is still an unpleasant individual. Nick thought before making his way over to the 2 Slytherin girls waiting in the distance. What was that all about? Tracy asked curiously. Nick shrugged. Nothing all that important, just a bit of business is all. He said honestly. He wanted a ring? She asked, surprised. He did, but I won't be saying what sort he wanted, since I doubt he'd be happy with his business being given out like that. Nick said with a shrug. So you got us out of the common room, what now? Tracy asked, changing the subject. No idea, I am going to do some serious reading at the library while I wait for my furnace to arrive. Originally I was going to swim all day, but that plan was ruined. He said honestly. Oh? Have some spell in mind to be modified? Tracy asked, interested. Nick grinned. Something like that, but you'll just have to wait like everyone else to find out. He said playfully. Ugh. What is the point of being friends with you if I don't get any special treatment? Tracy complained, and Daphne giggled. Well, first you do get special treatment, and second, being friends with me is benefit enough. Nick said while acting arrogantly. It wasn't hard if you just acted like Draco. Rather full of yourself, aren't you? Tracy teased with a smile. Oh please, the whole school knows I'm awesome at this point. Nick said while rolling his eyes. They probably also think you're mental for swimming in the Black Lake. Daphne pointed out, leaving Nick embarrassed. To be fair, the lake is perfectly safe so long as you don't go making anything in it mad on purpose. He defended himself half-heartedly. Is that why you looked like you just saw you-know-who earlier when the squid showed up? Tracy teased, and Nick scoffed. Whoever started the rumor that that was a squid deserves to be haunted by Peeves. The thing is clearly a kraken. No squid gets that big. he said irritated, but the girls laughed thinking he was joking. Chapter 74, The Art of Illusions. Nick split up with the girls after that since he was headed for the library and they weren't. They weren't the only students relaxing today, as in truth most were, with even the ever-studious Ravenclaws not having their noses in some book or other. There were of course a few students like Nick who were still studying today, such as Hermione, who was as per usual buried in a pile of books that served no purpose for her. Nick ignored the girl and started looking for books on glamour spells in the library, which proved to be a massive chore in and of itself. He specifically avoided the ancient section of the library since any books on the topic he found there are unlikely to be of much help in this case. This isn't to say he won't eventually look them over, merely that the normal books would be best for the ring. After an hour of thorough searching, Nick found a total of 10 books on illusions. He of course started with A Beginner's Guide to Glamour by Susan Corven. That was clearly an introductory tome on the subject, unless the author had played a cruel prank with the title. Illusions turned out to be a rather broad subject in truth, since according to the introductory statement of the book there were 7 subcategories that they fell into: touch, taste, smell, hearing, sight, instinct and combination. All illusions fell into one of these categories without fail, and those who tapped into more than a single one fell into the final one. The most famous example of this was the disillusionment charm that covered sight and instinct by making the caster nearly transparent and causing those looking at them to instinctually ignore the mistakes left. Nick skimmed through the book quickly, as the rest of it was less informative and more just a bunch of spells falling into each covered category. Nick wasn't interested in most of these spells since besides serving as pranks they were nearly useless to him. Sure, they had other uses, but Nick doubted he'd ever really need to make his farts smell like roses. After finishing with that book he started on the next one that was by no surprise also written by a woman and covered false beauty charms. He once again skimmed through this book but deemed it nearly useless once again. The third book however made him wonder Dumbledore hadn't put it in the restricted section yet. The book was called The Art of Terror, an illusionist guide, and much like you would expect from such a title it was filled with information about fear-based illusions. If there was ever a dark guide to use illusions, this book counted without a doubt. Nick was equally impressed with how informative the book was as he was with how disgusted he was at the spells contained within. There was even a legitimate curse in the book that worked like the fear toxin that Scarecrow used in the Batman comics. The only reason Nick knew this was because apparently the memories involving his personal life and things that weren't shared between the two Earths had been removed. The rest still remained, and apparently comic books were the same in both worlds, so DC and Marvel were a thing here as well. It still amazed Nick how similar things were between the two worlds despite the active presence of magic in this one when it was missing in his previous life. Nick didn't dwell on that rabbit hole for too long however and went back to his books. Nick made sure to memorize a couple of fear-based illusion spells including the curse so that he would be able to use them if it came down to it. Fear was a powerful tool after all, and if used correctly made for excellent protection. Moving on from there, the next 2 books were barely better than the first 2 books since they covered illusions that were small scale but fairly useful, such as the candle spell that made one see a single candle wherever they cast it. The nifty part is that you could actually use the spell to read without any actual light somehow. Nick chalked it up to magic. The 6th book was basically full of legitimate pranking spells that Nick may or may not have copied a few of for later use. The final book was called A Practical Compendium of Illusion by Quentin Fern, and like the title hinted, is full of practical illusions including the disillusionment spell. This book alone gave Nick the biggest boost in understanding illusion spells, as it even covered what made them similar to each other. Apparently all illusions worked by manipulating the information sent to one's brain before it was sent, which explained why it still worked on occlumens. Chapter 75, The Furnace. Occlumency was the magic of protecting the mind from intrusion as well as organizing one's mind. The way it did this however was from an internal point of view rather than a biological one, which meant that illusion that messed with the mind via biological means still worked. Despite finishing the books, Nick was not nearly done researching the topic, or else the timeline he gave Snape would be massively overblown. No, what he needed now was a true personal understanding of the subject rather than just fact memorization, and that will only come with time and experimentation. Nick's timeline had to include the time he wasn't using to learn about illusions such as class, sleep, smithing to improve his skill, and even hanging out with his friends. All that combined removed a whole 2.5 weeks worth of time available to him. This meant he in theory had about a week and a half's worth of time to get a good understanding of illusion magic. Not a super long amount of time, but certainly acceptable. The best part out of all of this however was that learning was worthwhile for Nick, as the more he knew the more dangerous and powerful both he and his works could become. He finished the final book just in time too, as the twins entered the library excitedly looking for him. "Oi! We got the thing!" They yelled at him, much to the librarian's ire, getting all 3 of them kicked out of the library. Did you know we had to go through like 12 people just to get this bloody thing? One of the twins complained loudly as they walked with Nick towards the Gryffindor common room. I wouldn't have made the deal if I didn't think you guys could do it. Nick said with a shrug. Tell you what though, since it was slightly harder for you than expected, I'll teach you how to use a spell perfect for pranks. Nick said with a smile, and the twin faces lit up with excitement. So it's called the ghost charm, and here's how it works. Nick then explained the spell to the twins and showed them the wand movements. The twins immediately tried it and cackled like maniacs when they shifted coloration to look exactly like the ghosts that roamed Hogwarts. They couldn't go through objects or fly like the actual ghost, but this was more than fine with them. They were already chatting between themselves about the best way to use this new spell to its fullest. Nick made a few suggestions like haunting Draco or attending class like that to make people think they died in their sleep. Nick didn't realize how dedicated to pranks the twins were, as some of their ideas were borderline crazy. One such idea was to rig up an invisible rope system in the Great Hall and act like a poltergeist during dinner. Nick could only wonder how doing such a thing in front of the entire teaching staff seemed like a good idea. Soon the group made it to Gryffindor Tower, and the twins had to shoo away the housemates that were eyeing the canvas-covered 2-foot-tall cube curiously. Nick carefully unwrapped the ropes and canvas on the furnace and marveled at it when it came into full view. It was primarily made of a grey stone material, save for the front and back of it that had metal doors as well as a set of dials on the side. These dials controlled the temperature, centralization, and even type of fire inside of the furnace. The first two were easy to understand, but the third required a bit of explanation to clarify. See, in this world there was of course normal fire, but there was also what are known as arcane fires that tend to have unique properties. An example of this was dragon fire, that tended to much hotter than normal fire and cause metal to resist corrosion it would naturally fall victim to. There were many different types of arcane fires, and the way this furnace worked is that it first required a sample of an arcane fire before it could magically produce it on its own with the dial to switch between them. This was actually one of the reasons so few people ordered new furnaces, as the older a furnace is the better the selection of fires tends to be, but the price also increases exponentially. Nick had seen fire seeds in the shop and could only shudder at the price that tended to be rather hefty, at the cheapest dragon flame seed costing nearly 100,000 points and the most expensive void flame reached 700 million points. Chapter 76, Salvaging Metals. Oh. Nick said, pleasantly surprised to notice that the furnace came preloaded with dragon flame on the dial. Something wrong, mate? One of the twins asked nervously after hearing him. Nick laughed. No, quite the opposite in fact. Whoever you got this from has done you a favor and loaded an additional flame type to it for free. He explained with a wide smile. The twins perked up. Really? Which kind? One of the asked curiously. Nothing crazy, mind you, just dragon fire, but it was still nice of them. Nick said honestly. Guess we should send them a thank you letter then. The other twin said with a smile. Nick finished his check on the furnace and nodded with a satisfied expression before lifting the heavy thing with the levitation charm. I'll take this to my workshop to get it set up, feel free to join me if you'd like. He said, giving everyone in the common room an open invitation. More than a few people shuffled behind him as he hauled the furnace to his room and unlocked the door with his key and entered. It was funny how many of these people stopped in surprise at all the tools laid out on the ground and the anvil in the center of the room. Didn't you just get this room yesterday? Seamus asked, confused. Nick set the furnace down at the far wall of the room. Yeah, why? He asked, not understand the problem. But how do you already have so many tools then? The boy asked seriously. Nick finally understood what was causing the confusion. I already had all these tools, but until I had this room they were in storage. He explained calmly. Seamus seemed to understand after that and remained quiet as he curiously checked out the tools with the others. Nick had to mess with some things in order to get the furnace at the right height for easy use, but eventually his workshop was finally functional. Alright, now I just need to get to work, so unless you all want to get hot and bored you should probably leave. He said honestly as he cranked on the furnace, sending a wave of heat throughout the room. Most of the people left, but Fred and George seemed eager to watch whatever he was about to do. Nick saw this and shrugged. Suit yourselves, I'm just breaking down materials till dinner, which is pretty boring. He said while pulling one of the lost metal items he got from the room of requirements and tossed it into the furnace. He then cranked up the heat and waited for the metal to start threatening to liquefy before pulling it out with his tongs and placing it on the anvil. Holding the metal with the tongs in his left hand, he struck the metal very hard with his hammer, deforming it greatly. Again and again he struck the metal until it was a completely flat sheet that he then folded over itself again and again till it was a square of folded metal. This then went into the furnace again to reheat till threatening meltage again before being placed back on the anvil and forge welded together into a rough ingot of metal. He then placed the still hot ingot on the floor in a corner before taking out another object from greed and repeating this process. He repeated this for 4 whole hours, during which time the twins chatted amongst themselves about what they were seeing him do. Flitwick also briefly showed up, having been drawn by the sound of the metal being struck. He briefly chatted with the twins about the importance of this step that Nick was taking care of early so it wasn't a problem later. Salvaging materials was a pain to do when you were on a time crunch, so it was better to get it done all at once. The small professor also looked at the various ingots that had been neatly placed in a corner and seemed surprised at some of the rare metals he saw there. He had an especially strange expression when he saw goblin silver amongst them. When 6 finally came around, Nick shut off the furnace and wiped his brow to clear away some of the sweat that had gathered there. Unlike a normal flame, this furnace was set at an extremely high temperature this entire time to expedite the process. With a wave of his wand, all the sweat and metal shards gathered off of him and were then banished. "I am surprised you two stuck around for so long," he told the twins honestly. "Seemed like something worth knowing is all," they said at the same time with grins. Chapter 77, Prank. Nick was confused. "I have no idea how this could help you make prank items, but if you say so," he said with a shrug. "Not this bit specifically, mate, but the whole process of making stuff out of metal. That ring of yours is proof enough that metal can be used to make amazing jokers, and we want to know how," one of the twins clarified as Nick and them left the room, which he then locked. "I can show you the ropes, but don't expect me to share any of my secret techniques with you," Nick said with a smile. He had no problem with passing on his metal-working knowledge, since it wasn't much different than the stuff this world had publicly available. He knew to keep the magical aspect of his knowledge hidden, however, since he had no plans on just handing out his secrets freely. "You'll be able to watch me actually make something tomorrow, though you'll need to leave when I go to enchant it," Nick added as he started to make his way towards the shortcut to the first floor. "Works for us," they said at the same time as they followed alongside him. Nick made it to dinner slightly after 6:30, but no one seemed to mind since word of his workshop had already started to pass around via word of mouth. Flitwick, who had actually seen the current state of it, happily shared the information with the staff and even shared that he had seen Nick already using it to a degree. "How was his skill, Phileas?" Dumbledore asked curiously. "It was rather odd actually, as it felt both refined and yet inexperienced at the same time. My guess is that it's a result of having learned it on his own," Flitwick said honestly. "Like his mind and body aren't in sync, yes?" Dumbledore asked with a gentle smile, catching the professor off guard. Flitwick recalled the movements Nick was making earlier and couldn't help but nod in agreement at Albus's words. "Yes, it was quite like that." "I assume you know why?" the small professor inquired curiously. "Oh yes, I myself have had a similar problem in the past. You see, this happens when one's knowledge of a subject outstrips their body's ability to use it, like the short delay that comes from a spell traveling through the air," Dumbledore explained with a smile. "The greater the gap between mind and body and the more pronounced the disharmony becomes. It isn't detrimental, so there is no need for concern, it just means young Nicholas has some growing to do." Dumbledore finished speaking and the other professors were left stunned. They figured that Nick was rather advanced in his craft considering the few items that he had already crafted, but to learn that this entire time his mind had been far ahead of his body was startling. It was also concerning, as it made them wonder what his limit was, and the answer most of them came to was sitting in the middle of the table happily eating while watching over the students. Nick was totally unaware that he was being compared to Dumbledore as he dug into a protein-rich meal with gusto. By this point in time no one was bothered by the strange eating habits he had, such as his seemingly bottomless stomach. There was a method to his madness though, as he specifically made sure that he got twice the regular amount of vitamins and protein that a normal growing body required, so that he also grew physically stronger while his body matured. After dinner Nick turned in for the night so he could get up at his normal time and get started on the prep work to make Hagrid's ordered ring. "The twins are going to hate me tomorrow," he thought with a mischievous grin. At dawn Nick got up and dressed in a casual pair of jeans and grey t-shirt before making his way to the twins' dorm room. They, much like their roommates, were still asleep, and Nick grinned widely before using one of the illusion spells he learned yesterday, Tayset Clamor. He said quietly while pointing at one of the twins. The result was excellent, as despite no sound actually showing up, the twin in question bolted out of bed like a mortar shell had just blown up next to them. "He he he he." Nick burst into laughter at the alert and pale red head, which drew the older boy's attention immediately. It took whichever one of the twins this was a total of 30 seconds to figure out what had happened and chuckle to himself, since it was a good prank. Nick was generous of course and woke the other twin up in the exact same manner, causing both him and the already awake twin to laugh at him. Chapter 78, Prep Work. Nick left after that with a wide smile while the twins got dressed and ready to go out. 10 minutes later the twins came down to the common room in their normal robes and Nick frowned. First thing you need to know about working around fire. He waved his wand and transfigured their clothes into larger but matching versions of his own. Never wear loose clothing that might get in the way or catch fire. He said seriously, and the two of them nodded in understanding. It didn't take much imagination to figure out why that might be a bad idea. So I take it you both had a pleasant night's sleep? He asked with a grin, and the twins chuckled. You got us good, we admit, but know that we shall have our vengeance. One of them said righteously, and Nick laughed. So long as you keep it out of my workshop I have no problem with that. He said before turning to leave the common room. The workshop was just a bit down the hall from the painting of the fat lady, so it took no time at all to arrive. Nick unlocked the door and quickly looked over the room but found nothing out of place. Can't risk it, he thought as he used his magical sensitivity to double-check the room, this time finding an anomaly. It was a small thing attached to his furnace, but the sinister tinge the magic held told him exactly what its source was. Feeling threatened, are we Voldemort? Nick thought, slightly amused at the pathetic attempt at sabotage that he pulled apart with a quick finite incantatum tuned to the hex itself. The thing's intended purpose was to cause his furnace to explode once a certain temperature was reached, likely killing or crippling him in the process. So he wants to avoid direct actions against me for some reason. Fine, two can play this game. Nick thought coldly as he ignited the furnace and switched the flame to dragon fire. He didn't turn up the heat, however, as he was aware that it was best to let the furnace warm up before really bringing the heat. He explained this to the twins as well as that it helped prolong the life of the furnace. The things were made stupidly durable, but they, like all items, eventually reached a point where they fall apart. Nick then went over to his stack of rough metal ingots that would actually not be all that useful as they are, but could be stored as is fairly easily. If he were to try and make anything with them as they currently were, the metal would be full of flaws and very brittle. Grabbing one of the numerous bars of dragon steel, he walked over to the furnace and cranked up the heat bit more. It took no time at all for the violent dragon fire to raise the temperature of the room by a large amount. The twins were glad for the transfiguration applied on their clothes as they were starting to heavily sweat. Nick barely glistened in comparison, showing off his heat resistance perfectly as he placed the metal bar into the furnace and shut the door. He quickly turned the centralization dial. All that heat seemed to vanish as it was instead concentrated in the furnace chamber. While he waited for the metal to actually liquefy, he explained why this was needed to the twins and why he hadn't done it yesterday. By liquefying the metal he could separate the exact amount of metal he wanted before shaping the rest of the molten metal with a mold into a usable ingot, killing two birds with one stone. Doing this for all of his metal will take way more time than what he had done yesterday. Still, dragon fire was no weak fire that took a long time to do its work, as the metal was little more than a puddle in the furnace by the time Nick was done with his explanation. Opening the door of the furnace, Nick quickly caught the liquid metal that fell out with his wand, as well as all the stuff still in the furnace, creating a bright glowing orb of pure dragon steel. Most of the metal was dropped carefully into one of the molds Nick had at the ready, while a small amount around the size of his thumb was removed. Once this gets cold enough that it mostly solidifies, I will begin shaping it. Any questions? He said, since he had time to kill. Why did you choose this stuff instead of the really good stuff I can see over there? One of the twins asked curiously. Kinda seems like a waste to make a ring out of gold if its only purpose is to ward off slugs. Nick said honestly. Chapter 79, Forging. The twin nodded. Yeah, that makes sense. Hagrid ordered this ring, didn't he? He asked with a knowing grin. How'd you guess? Nick asked, surprised. The poor bloke's been griping about slugs in his garden for as long as we can remember. The other twin said with a chuckle. Nick smiled. Yup, that sounds like Hagrid all right. Did you know when I asked him to think of an enchantment of some kind, slug repellent was the first thing he said. Nick complained jokingly. Sounds like a bad joke, doesn't it? He added on with a mock depressed sigh. The twins both laughed at his acting, and Nick checked the metal and nodded to himself when it felt mostly firm. Waving his wand, the metal was placed on the anvil and his hammer and a pair of tongs gently flew off the ground and into his hand. The first thing I am going to do is neaten this metal up so that shaping it becomes easier. He said without looking away from what he was doing. This was a simple process that involved a lot of small hits to ever so slightly modify the shape of the metal towards what he wanted. In this particular case he was basically just making it round so he could squish it into a hockey puck shape before fixing any issues that show up. Once the metal started to get too cold to work without damaging, he put it back in the furnace at a lower temperature since he wasn't trying to melt it again. Don't expect to be able to finish the work with a single heat, as contrary to what it might seem, the stuff does lose heat really fast. He explained as he went back to neatening the metal up some more. Another 2 heats later and he finally had a rough sphere without any cracks as far as he could see, which was a good sign. He then put the metal in the furnace and got it hotter than normal but not melted, and with a much stronger blow flattened the sphere slightly. Now that I am on the actually important shaping part of this, I have to be carefully not to crack the metal with my blows or it could force me to start all over. He explained, and the twins were watching him closely. Notice how my hammer's face is slightly curved? That is so that it more gently pushes the metal to the side when I strike down, preventing the metal from cracking more than if it was completely flat. Nick said while briefly showing the twins what he meant. Nick made sure that he flipped the metal constantly to more evenly spread out the stress on it. Soon he had a fairly even hockey puck of metal that he then ignores to grab a hole punch. Gently moving the metal to the hardy hole in the anvil, he tapped the back of the punch with his hammer, denting the center of the metal. He flipped the metal and did the same thing. What I'm doing now is making a nice even hole in the metal by distributing the force on both sides, moving the metal to the sides rather than straight up or down. Nick explained, and as time went on the twins saw what he meant. The center of the metal looked heavily dented on both sides, and with a couple more taps Nick neatly poked a hole through the thin bit of material. Now I'll work to widen this hole and get rid of any edges the ring may have. Nick explained calmly. Flitwick had entered the room at some point and watched on as Nick taught the twins the basics of what he was doing as well as the whys. To his great delight, the 2 troublemakers seemed positively enraptured by the lesson. All of the teaching staff were aware of the twins' knack for creation but had a headache about it, as they tended to use those talents for mischief. Still, it pleased the small professor to no ends to see them truly engaged in learning a craft. Maybe they would even get caught up in the art so much they ran out of time for their pranks. I wonder if I could get away with having a class or group dedicated to the crafts. Flitwick pondered after seeing this scene. While the school did teach alchemy, the number of participants was abysmal due to the extremely high requirements to even start learning it. More simple crafting classes such as smithing, jewel crafting or veridology may prove far more successful. I'll bring it up at dinner to see how well received the idea is, the small professor decided while watching Nick work. Chapter 80, Slugbane. Soon enough Nick had a simple smooth band of dragon steel that he then let cool before checking for flaws. Seeing none, he then took some transfigured sandpaper of various grits to the unfinished ring until it was polished to a high shine. And now it's time for you to leave, since none of you have signed a contract or sworn secrecy. Nick said calmly while also looking at Flitwick to show that he was aware of his presence this entire time. The small professor didn't cause a fuss about this since he was aware of it happening thanks to his previous chat with Nick. It's fine, mate, thanks for the lesson. The twins said at the same time before leaving casually. Nick could barely make out them immediately discussing how what they learned would be useful and smiled. Do let me see the finished product, I am quite interested in how it turns out. Flitwick said with a smile before leaving the room and locking the door behind him. Nick checked the room again for any magical trickery and finding none started the process of creating Hagrid's ring. As per usual, he filled his hands with spiritual energy, causing a bright white glow to emanate from them. Nick then began to infuse his understanding of what repels and kills slugs of all varieties into the energy. At first the coloration of the glow started to turn a brown color before slowing down in movement like it was mud. Nick frowned at this result and added his will to it as well to repel slugs, causing the color to shift to a greenish brown and become crystalline like salt. Finally he raised his hammer and strung the steel ring on the anvil, sending a humming sound through the room as the magical enchantment officially began. Bang! VRRRRM! Bang! VRRRM! Strikes and humming filled the room like an unusual and tonal music. Despite being cold metal, the ring was brightly glowing in a similar shade to the energy around Nick's hands. For 4 hours Nick beat the enchantment into the ring's every place, and with one final blow he swung down the hammer and spoke Slugbane. And the humming reached a fever pitch before suddenly stopping as the name set in. Ha ha ha! Nick panted while his whole body ached, and he dropped the hammer with the rest of the tools. Ring name, Slugbane. Grade, Uncommon. Abilities, Autozizing, Slug Repel, 26 meter, Slugicide, 25 meter. Description: a dragon steel ring created by an up-and-coming ring smith to repel slugs within its area of effect. System appraisal: an unorthodox but practical ring. Nick was satisfied with the appraisal since it showed his improvement since the time he crafted Sanner. I'll be referring you as well soon. Nick thought while rubbing the ring in question appreciatively. The ring had served its purpose well, but Nick knew he needed a more powerful enchantment to truly keep his mind safe. storing the completed ring in greed before removing quite a few snacks from the ring and eating them voraciously. Nick knew he had missed lunch during his forging session and his body was craving any sort of fuel it could get. Most of his friends assumed that he kept so many snacks for if he got puckish, but the truth was because he knew the toll that forging demanded from his body. I should really ask how to make Lemba's bread the next time I see the old elf. Nick thought as he ruefully ate his 6th chocolate chip cookie. Once Nick had satisfied his body's craving for calories, he shut off the furnace and left the workshop. He then took the shortcut to the first floor and made his way to the library since it was only 5 and he had an hour to kill before dinner. Sitting in the under-visited ancient section, he cracked open the book of fundamental magic he had gotten from it a while ago. He was halfway done with the thick tome and was eager to learn the secrets held within its pages. Unlike the books on illusions that he devoured in a single day, the stuff in this book was much harder to process, fully taking far longer to finish the book. Nick learned that apparently there used to be many more species of magical trees in the past, but that as the use of wands got more and more popular, they started dying out since they were being cut down faster than they grew. The author of the tome expresses great sadness at this fact in the writings of this part of the book, and Nick sympathized his plight. It was sad that in the pursuit of power, wizards had systematically cut off their own resources to it. Chapter 81, A Strange Plan. Nick suddenly had an idea, small at first, but the more he thought of it the wider his grin became. A garden of extinct resources for my use only. He thought with a bright expression. The way he planned to obtain these resources is quite simple really, and the best part was he knew exactly how to pull it off without messing with history. See, in this world the single most broken form of magic seems to be heavily underutilized, time magic. To be more specific, the magic of traveling back in time using a time turner. Any attempts to go further back in time than 5 hours always destroys the device, and since its creation method was lost, no one save a certain alchemist knew how to make more. Even worse was that any attempt to recreate the techniques is heavily prosecuted by the Ministry in fear of paradoxes. You see, history wants to happen, and if someone from the future goes back in time to try and change things, time gets shuffled in dangerous ways to compensate and keep things the way they were meant to be. This meant changing history is technically impossible, creating a paradox-like effect with dangerous consequences. Nick's plan wasn't to go back far enough in time to prevent the extinction of these resources, but rather to snatch an inconsequential sample of them that did not affect history at all and bring it back to the present. In this way, history is entirely unaffected by his action, and he gets to revive a whole garden of extinct resources to personally use. The best part though was that no one would know how he got these resources if he didn't explain himself. The Ministry may try and get greedy and seek to confiscate them, but by the time he can use this idea he will be practically untouchable already. Nick didn't write this plan down but made a mental note of it before turning his attention back to the book on the table. Meanwhile, Voldemort was slightly irritated that his sabotage attempt had failed, though not by much. If the boy is half as skilled as the old man seems to think, it makes sense he may check his equipment. I am being suspicious, however, as I made sure that it appeared like a prank taken too far, the Wraith thought with a sneer. I shall wait until the old man lowers his guard before I make my move on the stone. Halloween should do perfectly. The dark being laughed as he went back to grading papers from the upper years. Dumbledore meanwhile was contemplating how to obtain a drop of Nick's blood without panicking him. What do you think, old friend, would that work? The old wizard asked, the only other thing in his office looking for help, a large red and golden feathered bird perched on a golden rod, Fawkes the Phoenix. The bird eyed the old man angrily with a golden eye for a moment before turning away from him, causing Dumbledore to sigh. The supreme mugwump had been having to deal with his longtime partner and friend being in a poor mood ever since Nick had arrived at Hogwarts. Dumbledore was used to confiding everything with the Phoenix, but when he even sounded like he meant even to smallest amount of harm towards Nick, the bird shunned him. The old wizard could only smile mirthfully at this, as he was pretty sure it was because of Nick's connection to his wand. Phoenixes are fiercely loyal and protective of their own kind despite being prideful solitary creatures. Fawkes likely sees the boy as kin and as a result refuses to help me with anything to do with harming him. The only reason I haven't likely been attacked was because of the fact my old friend knows I mean the boy well, he thought with a tired sigh before returning to his plans. Nick didn't know that he was occupying the thoughts of two magical juggernauts as he eagerly devoured the information in front of him. Even if he did, it wouldn't have made much difference as he was too weak to resist either. 6 soon came around and Nick packed up the book he had made a little progress with and headed for the Great Hall. He didn't immediately seat himself after arriving, however, as he instead approached the teacher's table. Good evening, professors. I ask your forgiveness for my presence, but I wanted to show my latest work to Professor Flitwick before giving it to Hagrid, who ordered it. He explained respectfully while trying not to flinch under their stares, especially Dumbledore's. You may proceed. The old wizard spoke softly, but his voice still created a slight twitch in Nick that he quickly suppressed. Chapter 82, Regrets. If the old man noticed this, he made no mention of it, which Nick was grateful for as he approached the small professor and produced Slugbane from greed. The small man eagerly received the ring and began looking over it curiously. Ha ha ha. Yes, that does seem like something Hagrid would want, a slug-repellent ring. He said with a loud laugh after looking over the ring carefully. The enchantment is a bit unusual, but the piece itself is quite good, thank you for showing me. Flitwick said happily while handing the ring back to Nick. Nick nodded at the praise before walking over to the end of the table where Hagrid was sitting and waiting impatiently. Here you go, one slug-repellent ring. Remember to hang it up in your hut and to clean up the dead slugs from your garden afterwards. He said while handing the ring to the half-giant, who was quite happy to get it. Thanks Nick, I appreciate it. The large man said with a wide smile. Now if you'll all excuse me, I am simply famished and there's a plate of food calling my name. Nick said with a smile before walking back to the Gryffindor table while many sets of eyes were on him. Dinner was much like usual, with Nick devouring a bit more than normal, though no one noticed since he usually ate a lot. He of course restocked his depleted snack stores during the dessert portion of the meal, but that too had become a normal sight, so no one cared. A few girls tried to suck up to Nick after the meal in order to try and get free jewelry, but he coldly dismissed them with his best resting Snape face. All the girls who thought those ones shameless smirked and giggled at how ruthless Nick was in getting rid of them. Padma Patil even apologized on behalf of the female side of Gryffindor for the others' actions, but Nick merely shrugged it off. He made it clear already that he didn't work for free unless he meant it as a gift, and even then it has to be a special occasion. His work becomes worthless if he just goes around handing out rings like candy after all. Nick wasn't surprised to find out that a certain elf had shown up in his dream again when he turning in for the night. I'm not upset about the way you've used my inheritance, you know. The elf said with a sigh, and Nick was confused. You aren't? He asked in disbelief. The elf chuckled and shook his head. No, quite the opposite really. Unlike me, who was so fixated in leaving my name in history and only used my knowledge to make true masterworks, you have chosen to embrace the true potential of the craft and help all who request your services for an acceptable price. I honestly could not be happier about this. The elf said with an honest smile. Back when I was still alive, I was arrogant and wasted my gifts on useless things like pride and vanity. It was only when I was betrayed and my family was slaughtered before my eyes that I realized my mistakes, but it was too late. The man said with a melancholic sigh. You chose the path I myself should have taken, and it sets my spirit at ease to see it. But enough about all that, you have questions, I take it. The man said while waiting patiently for Nick to speak. How do you forge organic rings? Nick wasted no time at all asking a big question. Ha 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 ha, I have no clue. Exciting, isn't it? That despite all my knowledge and skill, I know less about the subject than you do. The man laughed happily. I have no doubt you'll eventually figure it out, but when you do, it'll be because of your hard work, not me. The man said with a proud smile. Well, since that's a bust, what about Lemba's bread? Each session takes a heavy toll on my energy reserves and it could really help. Nick said, not really minding that he couldn't skip all the trial and error. A wayfarer's bread, a truly marvelous thing really. Did you know there is actually 3 versions of it? The man said with a look of nostalgia. Really? I only know about the one kind that can serve as food for a day per bite. Nick said, surprised. Indeed, the truth of the stuff is that while they all do that, the benefits of each type are different. What you need is the soldier ration bread that is packed with proteins and vitamins so you can fight, or in your case forge on an otherwise empty stomach. I myself used it often. The man then explained how to create the stuff before the dream ended and Nick awoke. Chapter 83, Easing into the Schedule. Nick immediately wrote down the recipe for the Lemba's bread and left the Gryffindor Tower early to make his way to the kitchens. No one was awake at this point since it was shortly after dawn, and even Filch had turned into bed at this point after a night patrolling the school for rule breakers. Nick was still weirded out about how the pear in the fruit bowl painting giggled when you tickled it, but opened the door to the kitchens anyways. To say it was chaotic would be a lie, as hundreds of elves were constantly moving about in the room and food was flying to and fro as they cooked, yet none got wasted. Nick no sooner than stepped into the doorway than an elf seemed too eager ran up to him. What's the young master needs? The elf in clean linen rags asked, eager to serve. Nick wasn't racist or anything, but he had a hard time telling the house elves apart from one another unless they had some distinguishing characteristic. This one did not. Would you please make a few loaves of this recipe for me to use throughout the day? Nick asked with a polite smile while handing over the recipe. The elf grabbed the paper and vanished without the slightest hint of hesitation to go do as it was asked. While he waited, a couple more elves set up a chair for him so he didn't have to stand the entire time he was waiting, which he thanked them for. It was both disturbing and slightly cute how the house elves got super embarrassed at being thanked for their work. Nick found out while he was waiting for the lembas bread that he was actually pretty famous with the Hogwarts house elves as the greatest friend of Harry Potter. Nick thought it rather funny that in the house elves' eyes he was playing second fiddle to Harry when for the most part it was the opposite that was true. The bread was finished about 5 minutes before breakfast and the 5 loaves had been cleanly wrapped in cloth. He once again thanked the elves for their help before leaving the kitchen and heading to the Great Hall to actually eat. Today was potions and herbology just like last Monday, and Nick planned to get some practice with illusion spells during his free period. He paired up with Tracy and Daphne again since that was his preferred placement in the potions class. Nick grinned when he read the cure for boils recipe that was written on the board in the room, and Tracy noticed this. "What are you grinning about?" she asked curiously. "You see what's written on the board? Looks familiar, doesn't it?" he asked with a wide grin. Both she and Daphne looked at the board and didn't notice what was making him grin at first, but as they went through the direction mentally their eyes widened. "You're joking!" Tracy exclaimed in shock. "Nope, those are the changes I made to the recipe previously," Nick said, still grinning happily. Having a potion master like Snape use your version of a potion to teach students was pretty much the same as the man himself acknowledging your work. Nick could tell from the way the class went that Snape's way of teaching was to focus on 2 recipes for a certain amount of time before teaching another. This did get the students more comfortable around the subject, but the very professor's presence was enough to make people nervous and accident-prone, which removed some of the benefits. Snape tried to pick on Harry a little but quickly gave up when he realized that the boy didn't care. Still, the professor had enough sense not to try and pester Harry just because he wasn't reacting as expected. It certainly didn't help that Snape could practically feel Nick staring holes in the back of his head whenever he approached Harry. Nick had loads of fun messing with Snape by using a tiny amount of spiritual channeling in his eyes while recalling the man's death in the books. Nick's eyes didn't glow, but the technique was fantastic at unnerving even the bravest people because it was like death was constantly breathing down their necks. It's only fair he suffers a bit for trying to bully a student like that after all, Nick thought with a pleasant smile. Herbology was hell for Nick as they were supposed to trim whipvines, but he got slapped repeatedly instead. Professor Sprout had to get involved because he lost his temper and was about to unleash a firestorm on the fucking plant that had the nerve to act all cute after manhandling him. "It's official, I hate herbology," he thought while glaring at the plant venomously as he was getting scolded by the professor. Chapter 84, Self-Experimentation. The part about a firestorm wasn't exaggerated at all, as literally everyone in the greenhouse at the time felt his magic flare up as he drew his wand. The professor confiscated his wand until the end of class, more out of safety than a punishment. She did note that while he was calm and friendly most of the time, he also seemed to have a fairly short fuse for things that can cause irritation. She saw the entirety of what happened, so she couldn't really blame him for losing his temper after the whipvine slapped him far enough to leave red marks over and over again. Unfortunately, most magical plants tended to have similar defensive traits, and so she knew this was definitely going to be a bad class for him, much to her disappointment. Neville was a natural with the plants though, so while her expertise didn't appeal to Nick, it wasn't totally lost on her students. Once the class was finished, Nick grouped up with his friends who wasted no time at all teasing him. "You should have seen your face, it was all red and puffy," Tracy said while cackling loudly. "What was that spell you were about to cast, mate? It made the hair on my arm stand up before the professor stopped you," Ron asked curiously. Everyone nearby stopped to try and listen in for his answer since they had a similar reaction to his magic. Nick shrugged, sorry to disappoint, but it was just an overcharged fire summoning charm, he said honestly. "Must have been crazy overcharged if it made us all feel like that," Tracy exclaimed in surprise. "In case it wasn't obvious, I was positively livid at that moment, so holding back was the furthest thing from my mind," Nick admitted, embarrassed. "It's a good thing you're on our side then, isn't it?" Harry joked and everyone laughed. Once all the famous nonsense vanished, mostly thanks to Nick, the boy who thrived at Hogwarts and really opened up in the last week. He still had a small problem with keeping to himself most of the time, but that too was slowly vanishing as he took the initiative to speak on his own more often. "You guys head on without me, I've got a bit of work I still need to do," Nick said as he separated from the group. He made his way to his workshop while flicking his magic sense on and off in an attempt to remain safe while also not bursting a vessel in his nose. It proved unnecessary as he felt nothing off the entire trip and made it to the workshop just fine. He was paranoid and knew it, but considering the Dark Lord had made an attempt on his life the previous day, he felt it warranted. The man had apparently not decided to try again since there were no foreign magics in the workshop after a quick check letting Nick lock the door behind him and relax. The reason for the secrecy was because he didn't want to reveal that he was using illusion magic spells on himself to speed up his understanding of them. Personal experience was a heavy focus in the Celebrumber style and Nick knew that casting the spells gave him that, but he didn't want to bully some of the other students to practice leaving himself as the target. Having your senses messed with was a very unfun thing to experience, but at least this way he can understand the spells better having felt their effects on himself. Obviously he wouldn't use the darker fear-based illusions, but the rest were all fair game in his opinion. Nick took a deep breath and pointed his wand at himself in Vorto. He said, and immediately the entire room seemed to move and Nick found himself standing on the ceiling alongside all his tools and equipment. This illusion messed with one's sense of gravity and as a result made them think they were standing on the ceiling even while on the ground. This spell would give someone a complex if used outside. Nick thought as he walked around to acclimate himself to the strange sensation. He even tried to jump and was immediately overcome with an instinctive sense of vertigo as he could no longer tell up from down. For a moment there I felt like I was about to fall into the actual ceiling. Nick noted when his heart rate settled from the sudden strange sensation. Finite incantatum. He spoke and dispelled the illusion, restoring the world to the way it was supposed to be. He pulled out a notepad and wrote down the spell alongside its possible use to disorient an opponent. Chapter 85, Emotional Turmoil. Nick moved on to the next spell after that, Falsus Aurum. And a yellow-colored spell flew from the tip of his wand and struck him in the chest. He cringed as the spell took effect and literally everything he looked at suddenly seemed to be made of shiny gold. At first someone inflicted with this illusion may find themselves thrilled, but being constantly surrounded by a single color and hit with dazzling glints looking at anything became nigh unbearable. Nick shut that spell down immediately as he could feel a headache forming from it. That was downright unpleasant with how gaudy it was. Nick mentally complained. The spell after that though was far worse, about getting on his nerves, and he wanted to curse the person who made it because they were clearly insane. Chorus Cicadae. Nick's hearing was suddenly filled with the sound of thousands of crickets all at the same time. The worst part is that the sound seemed to move constantly. The sound grated on his nerves, something unreal, and Nick quickly removed the illusion and took several deep breaths to calm himself and not do something stupid. Note to self: learn occlumency for anger management. He thought seriously, as this was the second time today alone he has had a problem with his temper. He didn't know what the reason was for why he seemed to be losing control of his emotions recently, but it was starting to become problematic. Self-restraint was starting to become very hard with the way his emotions seemed to grow uncontrollable these days. He of course checked to see if he had been hit with some sort of spell that was causing it, but he had no such luck, so the problem was clearly something else. There was honestly so many different possibilities that Nick couldn't make an accurate guess what the problem was. Stress, the conversion to elf, his wand, and the list of possible triggers goes on and on. He didn't really need to know either, since all he really needed was to get control over himself, even if it meant deadening his emotions with occlumency. He spent the next couple hours experimenting with illusions and battling with the emotions them may create, typically anger. These illusions worked directly on a wizard, however, rather than on their surroundings, which is what Snape likely wanted to deal with. Still, the experimentation session expanded Nick's understanding of this branch of illusion spells drastically as he personally experienced their effects. Dinner time came and Nick ended up getting concerned looks from his friends who noticed something was wrong with him, but they couldn't figure out what. The three master legilimens in the Great Hall were even more troubled by him, however. To them he was constantly projecting emotions, which was fairly normal for children. However, his emotions were constantly rotating into different ones for seemingly no reason. Anger, sadness, depression, elation, tired, and more, just in a constant and random manner. All three of them could tell that there was a glamour over Nick's face preventing anyone from seeing his constantly shifting expression, meaning he was aware of the problem. For Dumbledore and Snape, they were worried that Nick had been cursed somehow. For Voldemort, however, he thought Nick had damaged his mind somehow, likely from incorrectly learning occlumency, which was a good thing for him as many spells required specific emotions. For him this meant if this problem wasn't fixed, Nick may as well be crippled beyond a certain point magically. Despite seeing this, none of them planned to involve themselves with it in hopes it resolves itself to their satisfaction. Nick found out what the source of the problem was when he went to sleep after dinner was over. "You know, I'm starting to think your luck might be a little off," the familiar elf said with a chuckle. "This situation has something to do with my transformation then?" Nick asked seriously. The elf shook his head. "Oh, it's a bit more complicated than that, I'm afraid. From what the system has told me, it's a mix between that, your wand, and the huge amount of ambient magic in your surroundings. See, the transformation of your soul into an elvish one has reached the part of it related to your emotions, and your wand via its connection to your soul is apparently pushing the personality of its core onto your soul. According to the system, the spirit of the celestial bird hadn't dissipated with its death but rather went dormant in the feather it gave away. All that remains is its power and personality, however, so the wand is apparently using the transformation to pass on this property, and it's messing with your emotions from the dissonance. The elf explained in a long-winded way. Chapter 86, Rough Time. What about the ambient magic you mentioned? Nick asked after digesting the information he just received. That's the nifty part. See, the system hadn't been able to calculate that factor into your transformation's timeline since it couldn't have information you yourself lacked. It's not actually some cosmically powerful thing but rather a mere tool, and its abilities require your input to do anything. In a way you could say it's actually powerless without you. Until you came to Hogwarts it was totally blind to the extremely potent magic that would soon be in your surroundings. The elf said, and Nick understood what was implied. So the timeline is actually shorter on my transformation? He asked, seeking verification. Drastically so, it dropped from 3 years to 1 and a few days. The elf said, good news however is that this whole emotional turmoil should clear up in 3 days, so try and keep yourself under control till then. He added with a reassuring smile as the dream ended and Nick woke up. Nick washed up and reapplied the glamour charm to his face to keep the others from getting too suspicious of him. I can do 3 days, he thought firmly. Nick underestimated exactly how difficult it was going to be, however, as Flitwick noticed the glamour immediately. Is something wrong, Mr. Iron? He asked, concerned. It's nothing to worry about, Professor, I'll be fine in a few days. Nick, while controlling his voice with much difficulty. Very well, but if you need help please do seek it. Flitwick said, obviously not believing him. The professor left Nick alone after that but sent a few glances at him every now and then with a concerned expression. Nick avoided his friends after the class was over and found a place to remain hidden from others as his emotions shifted constantly. The next day was far worse as he had to grip his broom very hard as it kept moving about due to his constantly fluctuating emotions. Astrology was much easier as it was merely cramming information again and didn't need much emotion at all. Defense against the dark arts, however, was a very big problem. Quirrellmort specifically seemed to have it out for Nick as he constantly called him out for various reasons. Demonstrate the spell, read from the textbook about so-and-so, partner up with Malfoy, things like that. It didn't take a genius to figure out that something was very wrong with Nick, and none of his friends could ever find him after class to ask. Nick got pretty close a few times to cursing Quirrellmort, and the man seemed to expect it from the way his body shifted ever so slightly to favor his wand. Nick had even been avoiding meals and eating Lemba's bread instead to fuel his body, and his absence was noticed by many. Thursday started out horribly since they had Dada first thing, but it was fairly smooth after that. The history of magic professor ranted on and on about the Goblin Wars, and Professor McGonagall minded her own business after ensuring he could still do his work. Much like he was promised, the turmoil finally ended late that very night and he slept like a rock as the mental fatigue of having constant mood shifts for 3 days caught up to him. Ron and Harry were actually worried he had died in his sleep when they woke up before him and even had to shake him hard to cause him to stir awake groggily. Ugh, thank Merlin it's finally over. Nick said as he got out of bed. Did you get taller? Ron asked with a confused tone. Nick looked at him and noticed that he had in fact grown a couple inches and now had to look down a little to make eye contact. Looks that way, let me tell you mate, puberty sucks. Nick said with a tired grin. Was that what was bothering you this whole time? Harry asked, confused. Nick nodded. Yeah, something like that. My emotions were all out of whack for the past 3 days, probably because of this growth spurt. Didn't want to bother anyone with it though, so I avoid you all. Sorry about that. He said, rubbing the back of his head in embarrassment. So long as you're fine now it's all roses. Ron said, happy it wasn't something to do with them. Yep, fit as a fiddle and twice as handsome. Nick said with a grin. Harry chuckled. Yep, you are back to normal. He said with a smile. They got dressed and headed to breakfast after that, since Nick was slightly tired of living of the nearly tasteless Lemba's bread. The professors seemed pleased to see him back to normal, minus a single one that looked disappointed. Chapter 87, Higher Interest. Voldemort was very unhappy to see Nick fully recovered from whatever he was afflicted with, as it meant the boy was still a threat to his rule. Even worse was that thanks to his clear targeting of the boy during class, convincing Nick of joining him is pretty much gone so long as he remained in this body. The boy had already proven to be vengeful with his actions against Draco Malfoy, both seen and not. Many people thought that the incident with the broom was an accident, but Voldemort had seen it for himself through the memories of others. Nick had clearly shown hostility towards Draco during that incident, and while he certainly was surprised by the way the broom in his hand reacted, it was indeed his doing. Voldemort was one of the few people to figure out how wandless magic worked very early in his life thanks to his poor upbringing. Emotions were powerful things in magic, and the boy's magic was clearly potent, so it was little wonder that he performed accidental magic in this regard. Voldemort was also quite interested in Nick's ability to create artifacts despite never learning ancient runes. Modern-day enchanting involved engraving runes onto an object and channeling very specific spells into the object. Nick clearly didn't do this in his creations, which anyone familiar with artifacts would recognize. The boy claimed to be self-taught, but Voldemort was more willing to believe that he had instead found an ancient wizard's inheritance, as the alternative meant he was more talented than him, Lord Voldemort, which was simply impossible. Dumbledore meanwhile fully believed what Nick said, as he was a master alchemist himself and as a result could see traces of the process in his creations. They were rough and unrefined but filled with potential, a scary amount of the stuff in fact even by his standards. Dumbledore could tell that Nick imprinted his own knowledge and will onto his creations while fueling the enchantments with the ambient magic. What he couldn't seem to figure out, however, was the method the boy used to accomplish this. At the surface this seemed like extremely high-level magic, but when truly examined its simplicity became apparent, and this confused Dumbledore greatly. It thrilled him to learn that there was a whole different way to enchant things than anyone else knew. He didn't find it odd at all either, since if there was one thing he knew from his long life of experience, it was that magic was an infinite thing that seemed to truly have no end at all. Perhaps I may even be able to convince the boy to share his knowledge with me if my plan works out, the old goat thought eagerly. Nick meanwhile was simply ravaging the food put on the table, as he enjoyed the flavor of good food after not having any in 3 days. More than one person was unable to figure out how he ate so quickly without making a mess like Ron. After breakfast Nick grouped up with his friends and had to try and convince the girls why he had been strange for the last 3 days, and even bribed them to let it go with a modified version of the Sparks charm that created a green-colored marble of fire. The spell was so horribly simple that Nick could modify it on the spot without much thought at all. After all, the original spell required no hand motions and even could be cast with the incorrect pronunciation of the words. All Nick needed to do was figure out what hand movement to add and mess with the words to get a functional variant. In this case a circular twirl and the word globus after the base word vertimilius. Honestly speaking, this version of the charm was far better for attacking than its base form, as it was far more precise and hurt way more on impact. The spell was still not lethal, of course, unless you literally stuck your wand down someone's throat while casting it, but then again a lot of harmless spells also fell into that category. Astronomy was once again a whole lot of cramming, though admittedly the professor slowed down a bit now that they had most of the information they needed. Charms class was once again focused on the Lumos charm, and Nick was conscripted by Flitwick to help teach again. Interestingly enough was that Neville had a new wand by this point, showing that he took Nick's previous advice. He apparently got it over the weekend and had been nervous that he would still fail at everything afterwards. He hadn't had any trouble at all and had improved by leaps and bounds, which helped his confidence considerably, though he was still quite shy. Chapter 88, A Normal Day. Nick helped his fellow students to the best of his ability, which even the other Slytherin students could appreciate even if they didn't thank him for it. Malfoy still tried to make himself a nuisance like always, but by this point Nick decided to unleash the horror known as the Weasley twins on him. He brought this upon himself for not learning his lesson the first few times. Nick thought with a sigh as he made this decision. Few people would understand the true horror that those two pranksters could inflict on someone if they really wanted to, since they knew how far they could push it normally. They made sure that any prank they pulled was actually a prank and not bullying, which was fine by Nick. Some people who are self-entitled and arrogant for no reason like Malfoy, however, would find these harmless pranks unbearable, and as it just so happened Nick was in the twins' good graces even if they owed him a good pranking for the wake-up stunt he pulled. He had no doubt at all that they were planning on getting him good, but they were perceptive enough not to do so while something was wrong with him. After charms it was lunchtime, and Nick ate a much lighter meal this time before he headed to potions with his friends. The potion this time was Wiggenweld, and Nick once again perfectly brewed it, scoring him a bottle of the stuff for himself by Snape's standards. Everyone else, however, had to write a foot of information on the subject, much to their dismay. So what do you have planned today? Are you going to ditch us again for that workshop of yours? Tracy asked curiously after the class was over. As tempting as the thought of working some metal sounds, I was in fact going to just hang out today. Nick said casually. Brilliant. I got some every flavor beans over the weekend that I wanted to use to play blind man's luck. Ron said excitedly before rushing off to the Gryffindor common room to retrieve said beans. What's blind man's luck? Daphne asked curiously. It's a game I came up with on the train involving every flavored beans that is loads of fun. Nick then explained the rules of the game and the two girls looked interested. Ron soon returned to the hangout spot with a jumbo-sized box of every flavor beans that hadn't been opened. Before they could start to play, however, a blue spell struck Nick in the back and all of his friends burst into laughter as his hair suddenly turned into a rainbow-colored afro. The twins hooted and howled in laughter at their successful prank, and Nick smiled before removing the magic with a simple finite incantatum, returning him to normal. Drat! We were sure it would take at least a trip to the hospital to get removed. One of the twins said unhappily after seeing their work so easily dismissed. Nick chuckled. It's rather hard to force me to such an extent as needing to go to the hospital ward. I assume you've gotten your need to get back at me out of your systems now? He asked with a smirk. Yep. We're even now, so hurry up and get us our rings. The other twin said cheerfully. I should be done with them by Monday. On an unrelated note, I have a bit of work that may interest the two of you, Nick said, catching his friends and the twins' interest. Nick explained to the twins about Malfoy and his attitude before offering a couple galleons to the twins to knock the arrogant child down a few pegs. Tracy and Daphne decisively remained out of this matter, as even in Slytherin House Draco was an insufferable prick. If this was about the house, they might have interjected and tried to stop this from happening, but since it was about only Draco, they were content leaving it alone. The twins saluted Nick and took the coins. We'll loosen him up real nice for you, mate, don't you worry. They vowed before rushing off to no doubt make Draco Malfoy tell his father about it. Till dinner time, Nick and his friends sat in the sunny courtyard and played blind man's luck, with Daphne surprisingly enough coming out on top by a landslide. Are you sure you didn't cheat in some way? Tracy asked unhappily after getting yet another bad-flavored bean. Daphne shook her head. Just lucky, she said honestly. You know there's no real way to cheat at this game, right? Nick asked Tracy teasingly. Even looking at the beans is more of a disadvantage than anything, since you need to eat some either way to win, he said with a shrug. Chapter 89, Twin Fear Rings. Tracy huffed, upset at her many losses despite Nick's words, but she didn't continue to complain about her bad luck. Dinner was an interesting affair as Nick ordered something totally new as far as everyone was concerned. It was a large bowl filled with rich fish broth, spring onions, a few slices of eel, not that they knew, and a bunch of noodles with 2 pieces of seaweed on the side. Despite the rich foods around them, the other students around Nick couldn't help but be attracted to his meal. Dumbledore had of course also ordered a bowl of the stuff for himself, having found that Nick had good taste in food in the past. It started to spread once the curiosity grew too much and more people started to ask for a bowl of the stuff. McGonagall and surprisingly Snape also ordered a bowl after seeing how much the headmaster seemed to enjoy the dish. Many found themselves delighted by the savory and flavorful dish that had graced their palates. It was on this night that many at Hogwarts would recall as the night that Raman was introduced to the British wizarding community. Where do you keep pulling these amazing ideas from? Ron asked after dinner was over. Nick looked shrugged. You know I didn't invent this dish, right? He said honestly. Really? Who did then? They must be geniuses. Ron inquired excitedly. It's a bit of a debated topic really, but most assume it was a Japanese individual, Nick said with a grin as Ron seemed to freeze in place. If my knowledge doesn't fail me, it was meant to be a cheap and filling meal before growing into the art it is today. He continued with the same grin as he gave Ron a reality check. Nick didn't blame the boy for not realizing that other places in the world are just as amazing as the one he lived in. Wizarding communities are heavily out of touch with even the Muggle world of their country, much less the other places in the world. The greatest example of this was that despite being right next to each other, if you were to ask almost any British wizard about the French wizarding community, they couldn't give you an answer. This was because the two communities didn't share information beyond their borders in most cases. They went to bed in good moods and Nick had normal dreams that night before waking up at dawn. He wasted no time at all going to the workshop and after a quick check turned on the furnace to warm it up. While that was happening, he went over to his piles of metal and picked out the same ones he used to create greed and snapped off a single folded layer of each of them. He then stacked these pieces on top of each other and waited for the furnace to finish warming up before cranking the heat up and switching to dragon fire. Nick then tossed all of the metals into the furnace at the same time before ignoring them to prepare 2 molds. There was far more metal than a normal ring involved in this forging, so the molds were equally larger than normal to contain them. This seemingly excessive amount of metal was actually the key that made greed capable of transforming into things larger than itself, such as the case when it turned into one of the twins' zombified faces. Once the metals melted under the tyrannical dragon fire, Nick removed them using his wand and stirred them together vigorously to ensure they were thoroughly combined. He then sent this mixture into the molds and set them aside to cool until solid and enchantable. This didn't take very long. merely 15 minutes or so, during which he did some stretches to limber up his body. Nick cracked open the molds and moved the hideous multicolored and ill-textured rings over to the anvil at the same time. A glow erupted from his body for a moment before concentrating on his hands. Raising his hammer, Nick channeled his knowledge of Bogarts before bringing it down on one of the rings. Bang! Hum! The moment he struck the ring, it began to hum, but that was where the difference between this forging session and his normal one started. Using the recoil of his first strike, Nick also struck the second ring, causing both of the rings to hum. He continued to do this until the humming of both of the rings was done in unison, like two similar voices singing the same song together. FWIP. Bang! On the final strike, Nick spoke twin fears. And the two ring for the briefest instant fused as he brought down the hammer before splitting into two rings that looked on different from the ever-shifting greed. Chapter 90, A Bald Ferret. Nick immediately fell out of the fugue state he was in during the end of the forging and had to grab the anvil to steady himself. Pain racked his body as the strain made itself apparent throughout it. Nick also felt like he had a hole in his stomach that needed to be filled as hunger gripped him. He had planned for this, however, and took some lembas bread from greed before eating a couple of bites. Almost immediately his hunger waned as the bread worked its magic, but he could still feel a faint trace of hunger once his body fully digested it. Ring name, Twin Fear, right. Grade, Uncommon. Abilities, Autozizing, Formless, Devouring Counterattack, Fear Transformation, Resonation. Description, a monstrous creation that was as half of a set made to serve as bringers of fear to their owner's enemies. When its owner is near the owner of this ring's twin, both rings will obtain a more potent form of their abilities. Much like a Bogart, this ring has no definite form and changes constantly. System appraisal, a dreadful creation that only someone with an abnormal mind could imagine, that was made by an up-and-coming ringsmith. Writing himself, Nick looked at the two rings constantly shifting appearances on his anvil and appraised them with the system. He was satisfied with these rings since they were also at the uncommon grade each and earned him 22 points each for creating them. Tempus. Nick said, and he found out what time it was and sighed in relief that he hadn't missed lunch yet, as it was only 10:47 in the morning. The time-telling spell was a simple but very useful spell to know, as it gave you an exact time regardless of where you are in the world. It was covered in the first year book of spells, so Nick had long mastered its use. He stored away the two rings before unlocking the door to his workshop and turning the furnace off. He left his workshop and locked the door again before heading out to go find the twins. Nick disliked putting off things for later, which is why he didn't simply wait until lunch to give the two of them their rings. It wasn't particularly hard to find the two of them either if one were to simply ask the portraits all over the school for directions to them. When Nick finally caught up to them, it came as little surprise to him that they were in the middle of pranking someone from Slytherin that Nick didn't know or cared to, for that matter. "Leave the poor sod alone, I have something far more worth your time," he said as he walked up to them casually. "Oh? And what might that be?" one of the twins asked as they chose to ignore their previous target as they escaped. "Why, you're half of our deal, of course," Nick said with a grin before removing the two rings from greed. The twins wasted no time at all, snatching the rings out of Nick's hand and placing one on each of their right hands. One of the twins frowned as if the ring felt wrong before switch it to his left hand and smiled in satisfaction. "That's interesting, I didn't think each of the ring were actually prefer to be on the side they were named by the system," Nick thought in surprise after seeing this. "So they work just like your own ring, right?" one of the twins asked curiously. "Yep, no idea why you wanted them since they require someone else to transform, but it's your business so I don't care too much," Nick said with a shrug. "The fear thing is honestly just a bonus for us, we just like the way your ring keeps shifting like that is all," the other twin said with a grin. Nick stiffened when he heard this, as he had assumed that this entire time they wanted the fear transformation ability of greed, but in fact they just wanted the formless ability it had. "Color me surprised to learn that they weren't just planning a cruel prank with the things," he thought with a chuckle that the twins returned even without knowing what it was for. Nick hung out with the twins for an hour after that before going to the Great Hall for lunch. He stuffed his face, which finally got rid of the hunger pestering him since earlier. Nick almost choked during the meal when he saw Draco walk into the hall without any hair at all and a death stare for literally everyone who looked at him. As if that wasn't bad enough, Nick found out that the prick had to stay like that for 3 days before Snape could brew up a hair restorative potion. Nick wished he had a camera to save this moment for later, but alas, it was not to be. Chapter 91, Flowing Time. "Man, where's Colin Creevey when you need him?" Nick thought regretfully after Draco got out of having this moment saved forever. After lunch, Nick went back to the workshop to practice illusion spells for the rest of the day. Time passed by after that, and before he knew it October had arrived as he simply lived his life day by day. By this point in time Nick had made a total of 10 other rings and had improved his illusion work considerably. He wasn't a master of the field by any means, but he at least knew his way around the subject. Out of all the rings he made, all but 2 of them were melted down into raw materials afterwards. They were simply things such as a ring that could serve as a lamp or one that could ward away toads. Of the 2 rings that Nick kept, one of them was a plain silver ring that was fashioned in the shape of an eye, with the band of it being a simple one. This was the ring that Snape had commissioned and was made with all the knowledge Nick currently possesses on illusions and how to discern them. He named it the Eye of Truth and got an uncommon grade for it, though the system clearly valued it highly, as he got 34 points for making it. Snape of course required a test before being satisfied with the ring when it was presented to him. It was a simple affair, as he simply put the ring on and had Nick use a variety of illusions, both obvious and not. The ring reacted to each and every single one of them, which was satisfactory for the man as he paid the fee for the work and went about his business with a new accessory. Ring name: Eye of Truth. Grade: Uncommon. Abilities: Autosizing, Illusion Detection, Area of Perception. Description: a ring created for the sole purpose of detecting illusion and warning its owner of them. System Appraisal: a fine creation made by an up-and-coming ring smith. The second ring that was kept, however, was entirely an accident on Nick's part, as he had wondered what would happen if he put his understanding of the entire world into a ring. The answer, as it turns out, was that he failed the forging utterly, as the amount of power required to imbue a ring with such an extreme topic was far beyond his current means. He failed to imbue his understanding of the world fully onto the ring he made, but the failed creation itself was enough to cause Nick's jaw to hit the floor. Ring name: N/A. Grade: Rare. Abilities: Autosizing, Broken Land, Corrupt Space, Twisted Time, Lifeless, Toxin Air, Putrid Waters, Dim Sun and Stars, Shattered Moon. Description: a horrendous ring that represents the failed attempt to create a world, and as such will erase an area of the real world 25 feet wide upon coming in contact with magic. System Appraisal: a failed creation that holds a terrible power made by an up-and-coming ring smith. Nick wanted to melt this ring down very badly, as its mere existence was a threat way beyond his means to control. Instead of keeping the dreadful thing, Nick instead found an opportunity to take it into the lake before tossing a spell at it from far away. He broke out in goosebumps when the spell struck the ring, as there was no sound nor ominous feeling. The 25-foot area simply vanished in an instant, and the lake water collapsed to fill the void left behind. Nonetheless, Nick still received a heft amount of 112 points for the creation of the ring. Add on the points he got from his other creation during this time, and he now held 463 total points to be used. I suppose I have been neglecting the system a bit, so let's see how many mystery tickets I can get. He thought shortly after waking up on October 1st. He made his way to the workshop and smoothly entered before locking the door behind him. Okay, so the first ticket cost 100 points. He purchased the ticket and the price shifted up by 50 points for the next. After purchasing another ticket, the price rose again to a new one set for 225. The price increases by half of what the current price is after each purchase. It seems this will get expensive fast, he thought seriously. This of course meant that he could only afford 2 tickets, as he was missing a bit of 12 points for the next one. Nick took the first ticket and tore it, causing a familiar mist to fill the entire room before coalescing into a roulette wheel. Nick spun the wheel eagerly. The unique sound of the pointer flicking each of the wheel's spokes filled the air for 2 whole minutes as the wheel spun. Soon the wheel started to slow until it stopped on a tiny wedge, and the wheel burst into mist again before rushing into greed. Nick paid the system no attention for the moment and tore the other ticket in half, causing a repeat of the previous event to appear. Once the roulette was totally done, Nick finally looked at the notifications. Chapter 92, Prizes and Classes. You received 1 Astral Hammer, 1 Immortal Blood book. Nick rather unhappy with these results, as he could have purchased both of these things for a quarter of the price he paid for the tickets. The first item was the special hammer he used while he was in the astral workshop that allowed a vastly easier time when it came to channeling his spirit into the hammer. It was nice of course, but he didn't need it strictly speaking in order to do his work. The second item was a book about vampires in the world of Tamriel, and while great if he wanted to make a vampire-specific ring, was otherwise useless to him as an elf or even a human. Still, he had already paid for the tickets, so he may as well use the stuff he got to the best of his abilities. He replaced his current hammer with the new one, which was way more noticeable with its silver color and faint ethereal appearance. Nick shrugged it off, since even if someone were to ask, he could simply say he found it in the castle. No one could argue with that, since there were a ton of things in the castle that were unknown even after people have explored it for the last 1,000 years. Besides, that was the immortal blood book he got, which he cracked open for a quick read. It wasn't a bad short story, all things considered, as it gave detail about the various abilities that vampires in that world had. But it was indeed a very short story, since it only had a total of 7 pages before it was over. That ending is fun to read, Nick thought when he got to the part where Muvarth was betrayed by the person teaching him about vampires, as they turned out to be a vampire themselves. Nick had already finished the Book of Fundamentals from the Ancient section during this last couple weeks. In it he didn't discover any more unexpected revelations, but merely had the knowledge he had obtained from the normal books broadened and clarified. He had tested his spellcast proficiency during this time as well, and found he was at an end of the first year level. This didn't surprise him much to learn, as while he was talented he spent most of his time improving his foundations rather than trying to grow more powerful. Nick found it wasteful to rush after greater power when he had all the time in the world for that, so long as no one offs him early. The first 2 years at Hogwarts weren't all that dangerous, minus the 60-foot snake that gets out, so this was the perfect time to take it easy and make sure he was fully prepared to deal with the future. First things first though, I need to get to the breakfast, he thought as he locked the workshop behind him and started to walk to the Great Hall. Nick didn't know what happened, but he found himself at the Great Hall but couldn't remember walking to it. He shrugged and walked through the doorway, thinking it wasn't that big of a deal since he gets lost in thought pretty often. Dumbledore meanwhile now had a small vial with a single drop of red blood in it that he stored in his robe. Breakfast was a simple affair, with Nick stuffing his face while Ron looked like he was trying to keep up. After that it was an hour of history of magic that Nick spent quietly chatting with his friends. He had been slowly distancing himself from Harry and Ron during this time, but once he was no longer a constant factor he stopped. He was still friends with the boy and hung out with him pretty often, but made sure that he was usually busy with something or another. None of Nick's friends minded his frequent absences in their hangout sessions, since he was different from them. Tracy and Daphne were especially appreciative of his work, as their parents were often stuck in their own business as well. Flitwick's class was different today, however, and the small man made it clear immediately. "Welcome students, this month we will be learning the levitation charm and unlocking charm," he said with a wide smile. "Today we will be learning the wand movements and pronunciation for the unlocking charm," Flitwick said honestly. "A new set of spells every month, I assume, is the schedule," Nick thought after hearing this. The first half of the class was rote learning, and so Nick simply didn't participate, nor did Flitwick think he should. The second half, however, was where a practical attempt was done for the spell, and with a wave of Flitwick's wand a single locked box landed in front of each of the students. Chapter 93, Rituals. Nick wasted no time at all and pointed his wand at the box in front of him. "Aloha Mora," he said, and the box opened right up. "Excellent work as always, Mr. Iron, 10 points to Gryffindor," Flitwick said with a smile. After that Nick did as usual and got up to start helping the others who were having trouble with the spell. He completely ignored the frustrated look he was receiving from Hermione as he made his way to the center of the room. His golden eyes flickered between each of the students as he calmly watched them. After watching for a few minutes he got the general idea of who was truly struggling with the spell and who needed only a small improvement to grasp it. Neville was surprisingly enough not amongst the former group and needed very little help, so Nick simply didn't give him any. Walking over to Ron, Nick stopped what the boy was doing. Slowly but firmly, "There's no rush, mate. Like this," Nick said, and slowly showed Ron the correct way to cast the spell. He then reset the lock and had Ron try, but even though he failed, the attempt was much better, and Nick told him so. Positive reinforcement was crucial when dealing with students, as it gives them that sort of rush of dopamine that makes them want to work harder to get more. This wasn't some sort of new concept either, as it had been used for most of history, even if the exact reason it worked wasn't fully understood by the one using it. Nick moved away from Ron and went over to the other side of the room where one of the male Slytherins were struggling with the spell. Nick didn't know the boy, but still approached with a helpful expression. "Your pronunciation is slightly off like this, Aloha Mora," he explained, and the boy slowly sounded the spell out, and Nick nodded and praised him for doing it correctly. With one more attempt the boy succeeded in unlocking the box with a look of delight. When he looked up, however, Nick was already further away helping another student. Flitwick had already secretly given Gryffindor another 20 points for Nick's work and couldn't help but marvel at the natural way he handled teaching. It wasn't some convoluted method of trying to get others to understand, but rather dumbing it down to manageable size without coming across as condescending. Once class was over, Nick split away from his friends and headed to the library to do some research in the Ancient section. Specifically about a book he saw there previously that caught his attention when he first entered that area of the library, A Beginner's Guide to Rituals by R.S. Black. During his search into the basics of magic, Nick had discovered a surprising lack of information on rituals, as thought the entire topic had been erased from the library. He wasn't all that surprised about this, however, as a look at the list of banned magics for the ministry showed why that may be the case, as all rituals were thoroughly banned. The sentence for performing even the simplest divination ritual was a minimum of 5 years in Azkaban. It seemed extremely harsh to punish someone with having to deal with happiness-eating monsters like Dementors just because of a harmless ritual. This isn't to say that Nick was doubting that there were some really dark and fucked up rituals, just that there were also useful and good ones as well. Ironically, this exact topic was mentioned in the book when Nick turned the page past the forewarning at the start. According to the author of the book, it was typically sacrificial rituals that fell into the category of dark magic. The reason for this is that the principle behind sacrificial was basically equivalent exchange, meaning if you were to give a wizard's life you could receive great rewards. The sacrificial rituals shown in the book were much different than that, however, as they required things like certain plants or other materials, and a couple had magical creature parts as ingredients. Nick found one sacrificial ritual that appealed to him greatly, as it involved basically trading the heart of an animal they hunted, the eyes of an bird, and the person who was conducting the ritual's hair for a small boost to their reflexes. Reaction time often means the difference between life and death in a wizard battle, so if Nick could tilt the scale into his favor by trading a few small things, he would without any hesitation. The steps for the ritual were also very simple, as he simply needed to draw a circle with a triangle in it before placing each of the ingredients in the corners before speaking the incantation. That was it. Nice and simple. Chapter 94, Rituals, 2. He didn't just stop there, however, with his reading, but moved on to the next section that was about obligatory rituals. The way these worked was both similar and different to sacrificial, in that much like sacrificial ritual, something was traded for something else. The difference, however, was that sacrificial rituals were one-and-done affairs, while obligatory rituals required one to do or give something multiple times or even indefinitely to keep whatever they got. The best way to explain the concept was that one would sacrifice wood at regular intervals to keep a fire going after they obtained it. Some of these rituals seemed useful but tedious in Nick's opinion, such as the one that needed one to sit under the full moon for the entire night every month to maintain an internal clock. A useful thing to have, but otherwise a tedious process to carry out. Nick read through all the rituals for this type given before directly moving on to the next section of the book that was about finite rituals. These, as it turned out, were basically just temporary buffs that were obtained via a series of actions. Things that would get you funny looks from those not in the know, like dancing with a rabbit's foot in the morning for a boost of luck throughout the day. This sounds ridiculous, but it was apparently a very real thing and did in fact work in some cases. The author expressed a profound level of disdain for this particular category of rituals and only gave a single usable example before going directly to the next type. Fusion rituals were, as the name suggested, made up of multiple types of rituals in a single ritual. The example given for this section of the book was the ritual of All Hallows' Eve. This particular ritual was a mix of sacrificial and obligatory that involved making an offering to your ancestors during the holiday in order to request prosperity for future generations. The catch was that it only worked for as long as the tradition is upheld, and once stopped for whatever reason 3 generations must pass before the family can perform it again. Nick wanted nothing to do with luck-altering magics like this because it was just as easy to bring ruin through it on accident. Tempting fate like that was the last thing Nick was willing to do when he could just get success on his own effort instead. All of this information, including the rituals, was only the first half of the book, however, and Nick was thrilled to discover why after finishing it. The entire second half of the book was an in-depth step-by-step instruction guide to creating rituals as well as modifying currently known one to better fit one's circumstances. This information was pure gold to Nick, as while it was complex and difficult to memorize, the benefits of doing so was well worth it. Unfortunately, Nick found one very big problem right away that made this knowledge useless to him at the moment. The biggest and most important thing for making and modifying rituals was a firm grasp of arithmancy, or the art of using math to assist in magic. The problem was that the class to learn the subject was only taught starting from the 3rd year onwards. Nick could self-study, of course, but doing so without guidance is simply asking for trouble. All it takes is a single wrong number when modifying a ritual, and he will go from giving grapes for a stronger sense of taste to becoming tasty grapes. Not a fun time. Helpless about the situation, Nick could only return the book to the shelf before searching for other books that contained rituals in the ancient section. He was rather spoiled for choice, it seems, as he found 5 such books in as little as 10 minutes looking. 2 of those books were things he wasn't going to touch, as they were about human sacrificial rituals and he wanted nothing to do with them. The other 3, however, were filled with obscure and useful rituals for all manner of things. Nick only got halfway through one of them before it was time for dinner, so he stored the rest in greed and left the library. Still, he had made a list of 3 rituals that he wanted to perform to give him a serious edge. The ritual of reflexes, the ritual of night eye, and the ritual of breath. The first had already been explained, but the second required the eyes of a bat and the eyes of a beetle and allowed one to have night vision. The final ritual was a bit special, however, as it required the lung of a dragon and the blood of the caster in order to give the ability to draw in the magic in the air to replenish their own with every breath. Chapter 95, Target. Author here. So quite a few people have been complaining about how Dumbledore had hit Nick with a confuse charm despite him wearing Sanner. I had assumed that I had explained it enough so far, but apparently not, so pay attention. The ring is very weak magically speaking due to it having been made when he literally couldn't have been less skilled with the crafting method. This means gentle mental manipulations like the whole eye contact legilimency stuff could be defended against, but brute force attacks on the mind such as the confuse charm overpower the ring's defenses at the moment. I had already explained that none of the enchantments he makes are ever absolute by now and merely got more powerful as his skill rose, but there it is, his craft has the potential to be unrivaled but is not at that level yet, since that would make this story rather pointless. I thank you for your support and understanding. Underscore 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 un. Each of these rituals will give Nick a distinct advantage in the future if he pulled them off, doubly so in the case of the ritual of breath. His sustainability in both forging and spell casting would greatly increase with that ritual alone. The best part about these particular rituals was that he could gather the ingredients without drawing suspicion. All the ingredients were either potion ingredients or things he could get himself with some effort. The dragon lung was actually an ingredient used to make some wizard-specific food like fire whiskey. The first ritual Nick had in mind was the ritual of reflexes, as he needed the heart of an animal he hunted, some of his hair and a pair of bird's eyes. He even had the best target in mind for the heart in question, though he'll need to brave the forbidden forest to get it. See, it was specified that the more powerful the creature hunted the better the ritual's effects, and there happened to be a very large and dangerous colony of monsters in the forest. Hagrid was a great guy, but getting Aragog a mate was the stupidest thing he could have done, as acromantulas reproduced by the dozen 4 times a year. The Forbidden Forest had hundreds of very large, notoriously man-eating spiders in it that are only stopped from being a problem by Aragog and the centaurs, who regularly thin their numbers. Nick had a pretty powerful lightning spell that, if he was careful, could be used to kill one of these acromantulas to acquire its heart. This would likely give him a very good result when used in the ritual. Looks like I need to go and have a little chat with the twins, he thought as he walked to the Great Hall to eat. Nick satisfied his hunger during the meal, all while planning exactly how he will hunt his target safely. So far he will have the twins lead him into the forest, as they have experience in this regard, before he carefully approaches the edge of the acromantula's colony. He figures that he will likely find at least one singular member of the colony testing its luck there. He then fries the big spider, takes its venom and heart before hightailing it out of the forest. Nick wasn't stupid enough to try to do more than this in the forest. One spider out of a few hundred is almost unnoticeable, but he would have to be a madman to even consider trying to hunt any of the things that weren't pushing their luck at the border of their territory. The giant spiders love to ambush potential prey, so heading into their territory is asking to find oneself surrounded. Still, before he decided to go through with his plan, he needed to practice the lightning spell he accidentally discovered before school started. The room of requirement should be able to create a target range, he thought seriously while eating. Nick turned in for the night right after dinner, since he wanted to be well rested for tomorrow. The classes should also be easy, as it was merely flying, astronomy and Dada for a single period each. He laid low in flying class like usual, much to the disappointment of Madame Hooch, who knew he was doing it. Next up was astronomy. That was super easy, as the class was basically cancelled for the rest of the week, since the professor was satisfied with their current level of knowledge and thus was shuffling their schedule. Nick merely chatted with his friends for the entire class, since the professor gave them permission to do so. Dada was a joke with the way Choir Elmort stuttered through every sentence, and they had barely gotten into the interesting stuff such as how to deal with magical creatures. In fact, the man avoided that topic all the time, and when specifically asked about the topic he would change the topic entirely. Thankfully, this was a topic that could be self-taught just fine and didn't really need much input from a professor, and everyone knew it. After the class was over, Nick immediately took a series of shortcuts to reach the 7th floor and then secretly went into the room of requirement. This time the room was a huge area with fast-moving wooden puppets moving around it erratically. The reason for this was because he had asked for the most difficult target practice room possible for long-range spells. The acromantulas is a very dangerous creature, and the mobility it has is no laughing matter, so Nick needs to hit a fast and tricky target from range with a bolt of electricity. Close-range combat against a spider is asking to get killed, so hellish target practice it is. Chapter 96, First Ingredients. Nick brought out his wand and took a stance he was comfortable with before pointing downrange at the erratic target Siglid. He said, and a thin blindingly white bolt of electricity shot across the room. Unfortunately the target he was aiming at moved the very same moment he cast the spell, causing it to miss and strike the far wall and leave a black scorch mark. Nick tried again and again for the rest of the day, even skipping dinner, as he stubbornly attacked with the spell. As he grew more familiar with it, the power and accuracy of the spell increased drastically. Nick left the room of requirement late at night and evaded Filch and his cat Mrs. Norris via a series of shortcuts to the common room. His entrance was noticed by Harry, but the boy didn't confront Nick about his whereabouts. The next morning Nick woke up and yawned tiredly as he get ready for class. He ate a large breakfast in order to cover for the lack of dinner the night before and prepared for the morning's class. Nick was bored during the class since he already knew all the stuff that Choir Elmort was teaching, and it showed. The fact that they had history of magic right afterwards wasn't much better, and Nick had trouble not dozing off the entire time. Lunch better for Nick as he mostly recovered by that time and ate heartily. The final 2 class period in the day belonged to Transfiguration class and was easily the most mentally challenging part of Nick's schedule. C. McGonagall's request to have Nick removed from General Transfiguration class and taught privately had been denied, so the crafty old witch had to get creative. While the rest of his classmates were working on their actual class lesson, Nick had to perform rapid transfiguration on multiple objects while McGonagall constantly sabotaged his work. This wasn't technically beyond what the other students were doing, but was still very good training for Nick to transfigure in an instant without issue. It helped that they both clearly enjoyed the process as they challenged each other to a good degree. After the class was over, Nick was finally confronted by Tracy and the rest of his friends about where he was yesterday. "I got a bit carried away while practicing a spell is all," Nick said with a shrug. "What in Morgana's name could possibly keep you of all people so focused?" Ron asked incredulously. The rest nodded in agreement, as they were all aware that Nick was leagues ahead of literally everyone else in their year in terms of casting. "It's a spell on the level of the blasting curse in terms of power, so you'll forgive me if it might take me a bit longer than normal to fully master," Nick said sarcastically. "I don't know what the blasting curse is, but that sounds rather dangerous," Harry said, concerned. Nick shook his head. "So long as I don't go trying the spell out on myself, I'll be just fine," he said reassuringly. "You wouldn't happen to be willing to share said spell, right?" Tracy asked while giving him her best puppy dog eyes. "Nope," Nick with a grin as she looked horrified that it didn't work. "One of these days I'll get you to spill those juicy secrets of yours," she vowed, indignant at her loss. "The only thing you'll get from me is what I no longer have a need for," Nick said with a wide smirk. "I really hate you sometimes," Tracy complained. Nick cackled madly. "Good. Let the hate flow through you," he said, imitating a certain character. No one got the reference, but they laughed anyways before splitting up since Harry had Quidditch practice today. Nick didn't go back to the room of requirement to train his lightning spell since he still had other ritual ingredients to obtain before his hunt. The castle had a large population of predatory owls in it, so Nick saved him the effort of having to track down a bat and a bird to take the eyes from. In fact, all he needed to do was politely ask for the things from the owls in the aviary and the owls went straight to it. He barely needed to wait 5 minutes before the dead body of a quail and a bat were deposited in front of him. Nick thanked the owls for their help while carefully storing the 2 sets of eyes in special preservative potion. The eyes of a beetle were even easier to acquire, as Nick merely needed to flip a few large stones before he found a nice-sized beetle under one of them. With this he now had the items he needed to conduct the ritual of Night Eye and gain night vision, which was very useful in a dark place like the Forbidden Forest. Chapter 97, Secret Ritual. Nick didn't rush off to go do the ritual immediately due to the fact that the ritual itself calls for it to be done in a specific environment. The exact steps for the ritual was to first find a place without any light and then draw the circle with a single line from east to west through the center. The eyes of the beetle go on the west end of that line while the eyes of the bat go on the east. The caster then stands in the center of the circle between both points, removes all light from the area and makes sure it is after 8:00p.m but before 2:00a.m. With the rest of this done, the incantation is spoken, and if done correctly the sets of eyes will transform into smoke and flow into the wizard's eyes, giving permanent night vision. Nick obviously had some time before 8 at night, so he instead went to his workshop and continued reading the ritual books he had taken from the library. It was truly a wide and profound subject, as many of the rituals never showed up again in any of the other books, even if the end result of some of them were the same. Within the time until dinner, Nick finished one book and was halfway through another, with him only finding one extra ritual to add to his list of planned ones. This ritual was known as the Ritual of Nature, and what it did was give a large jump in magical power but had harsh requirements to perform. First, the caster must be under the age of 13, second was that the boost received must include vital parts from at least 3 magical creatures and less than 7. The exact parts and creatures were irrelevant to the ritual, but more powerful creatures' parts gave better results. Third was that the ritual must be performed during Beltane, or the annual event where magic floods the planet, for exactly 3 hours. Specifically the hours of 11 p.m. to 1 a.m. on May 1st, and this ritual can only be used a single time in one's life. It was also specifically stated that this ritual has no effect at all on future magical growth, so it's all benefits and very little cost beyond money and time. Nick would likely have plenty of money after this time, so collecting 6 powerful creatures' parts in the next 7 months is no problem. One of them he could get during his hunt for an acromantula in the forest, since the big spider's heart wasn't considered its vital part but rather its pincers and venom sacs were. The best part is they didn't need to be full of venom to count either. Hunting an acromantula was like killing 3 birds with a single stone, making Nick more sure that it was the best choice he could make. He wasn't sure what the other parts from other creatures would be, but he had plenty of time to work out those details later. Packing up the books into greed, Nick made his way to the Great Hall for dinner, and when he arrived didn't notice the conflicted look Dumbledore was giving him. Rewind much earlier in the day on the old wizard's side, and Dumbledore had made a trip to Gringotts early in the morning. This was a special visit on his part, as he had come not as a political figure but as the technically legal guardian of the orphan Nicholas Iron. Dumbledore found it funny how by wizarding law he was the guardian of every magical orphan in the British Isles when he had no children himself. Normally consent needs to be given when the blood is drawn for an inheritance test, however as the legal guardian of the boy he had the right to waive this away. The goblins were respectful of him when he arrived, as he was a very important person and held a lot of holdings in his hands. Dumbledore was amused at the look he got when he spoke to a goblin at a counter about getting an inheritance test done. He was aware that he was over 100 years old by now, and so asking to see if he had any interesting ancestors at this point was extremely odd. It was only after he had been asked to present his blood that he cleared up the confusion by handing over Nick's blood instead of his own. The goblin in charge of the ritual was very much unamused by the misunderstanding, but still went through with the test. At first everything was going smoothly, but then the image summoned by the ritual transformed into an silver and blue eagle crest thrumming with power that made Dumbledore realize he may have made a very big miscalculation. Chapter 98, Consequences. For the first time in a very long time, Dumbledore was left at a loss as to what to do with the situation he found himself in. Of all the bloodlines to posses, it had to be one of those. He thought with a sigh as he felt a headache forming. Had Nick been a normal and uninteresting student, this discovery wouldn't have mattered much to Dumbledore, as he had taught at least 4 people with the blood of the founders in his time at Hogwarts. The problem came into factor from 4 crucial details about Nick. The first was that the boy was monstrously talented, to the point it may not be considered an exaggeration to say he is the second coming of his ancestor. In the short span of 2 months and a week since Nick was formally exposed to magic, he had grown by leaps and bounds. Not only did he obtain an absolutely unique wand, but had started to shift in terms of presence and appearance. It was so small that no one else seemed to notice it, save perhaps his sudden change in eye color. Dumbledore was willing to admit he had also almost missed it had the boy not approached the professor's long table recently. The second problem was because the boy had created a method to forge and enchant rings without any teaching or understanding about the significance about what he had done. Such a clear and concise level of potential in that art was concerning, to say the least. It was one of the reasons Dumbledore was thankful that his old student Tom had thoroughly alienated the boy from him. The 2 of them actually joining forces would probably result in a terrible outcome for the world. Nick was odd from a personality aspect as well to Dumbledore, as he was warm, cold, friendly, dismissive, proud, and secretive all at the same time. It was no wonder the sorting took so long. The boy is perfect for every house, the old man thought with a chuckle. Dumbledore had noticed Nick slowly distancing himself from his friends, but considering that he also preferred to spend his time working or studying, Dumbledore didn't consider it odd. The fear the boy showed towards him was rather extreme, however, which was what had prompted Dumbledore to this action, since he assumed that fear may vanish if he acquired some political backing. This brought up the third problem for this turn of events: the boy is bound to figure out what happened here. Nick had proven himself far too clever not to piece together the pieces of the puzzle and realize that he had his blood taken and used without his consent by Dumbledore. This was very bad, because if nothing else he had shown himself to be vengeful, and so Dumbledore had alienated the boy entirely with this action. It was ironic how both he and Tom wanted to bring the boy to their side but had only pushed him away from both. Tomorrow morning when the owls come to deliver mail, Nick was definitely going to receive a package from the Gringotts goblins. Dumbledore can already foresee the scene as the boy has a look of confusion before his eyes snap angrily towards himself as he figures it out. It would come as no surprise at all to Dumbledore if Nick were to thoroughly denounce him in front of the entire school and was prepared to apologize. The worst case, however, was if the boy were to bottle up his anger and act as if nothing happened. The old man knew that in that particular case he may need to keep an eye out for vengeful acts against him from the shadows. The fourth and final problem was rather minor but also extremely important as well. The fact that Nick was descended from Ravenclaw should be impossible because the only known child of Rowena Ravenclaw was the Grey Lady who died and became a ghost before having any children of her own. This led Dumbledore to a rather terrifying possibility: the Hogwarts founder had another child in secret and that child's line had been moving through the shadows of history undetected. This meant that by publicly exposing Nick in this way he had suddenly brought what may be a line of hidden wizards to the public forefront. The amount of attention this will bring to Nick is undoubtedly going to raise the boy's anger to a terrifying level. Sure, Nick may benefit greatly from the sudden lordship, but Dumbledore was aware of the boy's aversion to the idea of relying on his heritage to succeed. None of this even considered how the Grey Lady herself may react to this news, which is a subject Dumbledore was dreading to think about. Chapter 99, The Letter. Back to the present. Dumbledore was dreading breakfast tomorrow but refused to try and avoid this event of his own making. The headmaster of Hogwarts may be accused of many things, but cowardice is not one of them. He created this situation and was willing to deal with the consequences of his actions. Nick, however, was unaware of the massive problem coming his way as he ate his dinner peacefully. After dinner was over he left the Great Hall and took a shortcut to the 7th floor in order to use the room of requirements for his upcoming ritual. Nick asked for a completely clean and unlit room and the roar delivered without any problem at all. Wasting no time at all, he began by determining the cardinal directions before drawing the ritual circle as per the book's instructions while having the room lit up with a Lumos charm. Nick placed the ingredients in their designated places before standing in the center of the circle and extinguishing the Lumos charm, covering him in darkness. Non obstruit me obscurum sicut ego principio tibi. He spoke the ritual's activation phrase and immediately felt the magic in his body react. It traveled out from his feet and through the line in the center of the circle before lingering on the 2 ingredients for a moment before filling the rest of the circle and then pulsing. As soon as this pulse happened, the sets of eyes burst into smoke that then flowed along the line before creeping up Nick's body and the flooding into his eyes, causing him to cry out in pain as the magic worked to modify his eyes. Blood dripped from Nick's eyes for 5 minutes before the pain stopped and he could finally open his eyes again. Nick was surprised at how clearly he could see despite the absence of light, as it was like everything was slightly shadier than if it was a sunny day. Nick also felt the blood on his face and looked down at the floor before sighing and cleaning it off before banishing it. He also removed the ritual circle and left the roar to head to bed. A couple secret passages later and he reached the portrait of the fat lady, who merely smiled and shook her head at him. Marmalade. He spoke the password and the portrait swung open to allow him through without a word. It was practically tradition at this point for a Gryffindor to break the school's rules in regards to the curfews, so the fat lady was totally used to it by now. The ritual hadn't taken Nick very long to complete, merely an hour. This meant he still got to bed at a fairly decent hour, which was good because that ritual had mentally exhausted him. He didn't meet the elf in his dreams on this night and woke up at dawn as per usual. Nick was in a good mood after waking up as his plans were coming together nicely and he went to breakfast with a wide grin. Breakfast started out fairly normal as everyone sat down and the food appeared thanks to the house elves, and the meal began simply. Then shortly afterwards the owls started to fly down and deliver the mail. This was when Nick and those familiar with him were surprised as a large tawny owl landed in front of him with a small box with a letter tied to it. Nick paid the bird and gave it some bacon as a treat before sending it away with a confused look. "Whatcha got there, mate?" Ron asked curiously, and Harry also seemed curious. "I'm not sure, I don't have any family nor did I order anything, so I am confused why I got mail," Nick said honestly. "Try the letter, maybe it will help," Harry suggested helpfully, and Nick nodded in agreement and removed the letter from the twine of the package and looked it over. It was a simple white envelope seal with a golden wax signet seal in the shape of a capital G stylized to look like a goblin's head. Nick didn't recognize the mark and so showed it to Ron, who knew what it was immediately. "That's the Gringotts mark, this must be important," he said seriously, and Nick wasted no time breaking the seal with a knife and removing the single sheet of paper out of the envelope. The letter read as such. "Dear Mr. Iron, we at Gringotts are writing to inform you as to the results of the inheritance test performed under the request of one Albus Percival Woolforth Dumbledore. The details of the test are in the parcel attached to this letter. We sincerely look forward to future business with you and wish you a profitable day. Sincerely, Warwick Davis." Chapter 100, Wrath and Reveal. The very air in the Great Hall suddenly seemed to become stagnant and the Gryffindor table groaned and cracked as an invisible pressure fell upon it. Nick's lips were pulled back in a vicious snarl of pure unadulterated rage as the hand hold his pewter cup crushed it without any regards to the shards of metal that stabbed his hand. Sparks of electricity and fire popped off from Nick's holstered wand as it vented the rampaging magical energy he was releasing. Everyone within 20 feet of him suddenly paled and shivered in fear as the feeling of a dragon waking up in a foul mood came over them. No one noticed it immediately, but the enchanted ceiling of the Great Hall started to shift from a normal partially cloudy day to dark and brooding. Nick reached for his wand with a positively murderous expression and a spell rang out in the silent hall as Snape reacted instantly stupefied. The spell struck Nick and he passed out under its effects, and the whole Great Hall sucked in a breath as if they had all forgotten to do so. It would seem I underestimated how severe his reaction would be, Dumbledore thought with a concerned look. Ron reached across the table and grabbed the letter that had been dropped by Nick while everyone watched and waited to understand what had just happened. He slowly read what was written, growing flushed from his own anger as he did so, and in the pin-drop silence of the Great Hall everyone heard him. Only those not aware of what the inheritance test at Gringotts involved had confused looks on their faces, while the others all had one of three expressions: outrage, disbelief, and wariness. All of these expressions were targeting the old wizard sitting in the middle of the professor's long table with a helpless smile. "Open the other package and read its contents, Weasley." Snape spoke calmly, and no one moved to stop Ron as he started to unravel the twin holding the parcel shut. When unraveled, two things fell onto the long table in front of Ron: a silver and blue ring with an eagle on its face and another letter. Many people who recognized the style of the ring paled and gaped in disbelief. Ron was included amongst that number, as he had seen a ring that was so very similar on his father's finger. Ron nervously reached out and grabbed the letter and started reading its contents out loud shakily. "We at Gringotts would like to congratulate you on the discovery of your relation in regards to the Ravenclaw family. Due to not having any other claimants, the lordship and authorities involved are hereby bestowed upon your person as the last known living member of the household. Enclosed in this parcel is your signet ring, which acts as both verification of your station and key to the vaults held under our care. We look forward to your visit at the earliest possible convenience to discuss your assets." Ron finished speaking and dropped the letter while looking at Nick's unconscious self in disbelief. From the professor's table there was various expressions on the faces of the staff, with the hospital caretaker Madame Pomfrey looking worried as she rushed over to Nick to check on him. She called Hagrid over and had the large man carry Nick to the infirmary, though not before the man collected his things, including the ring. Once they left the Great Hall, the students burst into chatter about this massive piece of news that had shown up out of nowhere. Meanwhile, McGonagall and Flitwick both had stony expressions as they looked at Dumbledore, who throughout this entire event hadn't spoken a word. He never got the chance really, as Nick had clearly been about to full-on attack him in anger when Severus stopped him. The broody potions teacher may not be a very expressive man, but the headmaster could see the disappointment in the man's eyes. Nick was excused from today's classes and breakfast ended without any other disruptions, but the damage had already been done. No one could get the events of breakfast out of their heads, as even those who weren't aware of the big deal it was were informed by their housemates. A certain ghost in the castle, however, was euphoric at the news and rushed towards the infirmary anxiously. Snape was an exceptional combatant and noticed the look and body language that the boy had after reading that letter. The magical chaos only further solidified in the man's mind that his fully powered knockout spell was for the best, but after learning the truth of the matter, he regretted stopping the boy from attacking Dumbledore. My patrons can read at least 12 chapters ahead, along with using the site as a way to directly contact myself rather than needing to hope I respond to your comments.